Gilligan's Island was a comedy television series involving 7 castaways that get shipwrecked and stranded on an island, focusing on their attempts to escape, which always fails because of Gilligan's fuck-ups. The show ran for 3 seasons in the mid-1960s, but despite the short run, the show became a classic and aged well in reruns years later. In 1990, Bandai released a video game based on the series for the NES. You'll control Skipper, who is followed constantly by Gilligan. Each level, or episode as they call them in this game, is designed like a maze. You'll wander around, meet up with the other characters from the show who give you clues which help you to find items that assist you in achieving the episode's objective. All the characters from the show are included, except for Ginger for some reason. But she was just a conceited Hollywood bitch anyway. She would have been of no assistance other than eye candy and a distraction from getting off the island. Usually your only means of defense is punching, which is useless about 95% of the time. If you're facing off with these headhunters, you should be able to punch them, but all the animals on the island that are out to kill you for whatever reason, they're practically impossible to knock out. You pretty much have to avoid them. Gilligan stays behind you and contributes absolutely nothing, other than assisting you in some of these tasks like climbing a tree to get an item. At the same time, Gilligan also becomes the most frustrating part of the game. If you get just a little bit ahead of him and walk to another screen, he won't follow, and you have to go back and get him. This happens all the time, but it gets worse. There are a lot of holes that lead you to underground portions of the stage, and if Gilligan falls into one of them, guess what? You'll have to go down to retrieve him and find your way back up to the surface, because sometimes there's no ladder at the hole you descend. Sometimes you'll want to slip down one of these pits, but if you go down first, Gilligan won't follow. Instead, you have to pretty much lead him into it by walking around the hole and hoping your general direction will guide him down. It's such a stupid, cheap chore that the game makes you do. Not to mention that once you lose Gilligan, you'll get hit with a 2-minute time limit to find him, and once you do, the regular timer restarts. Oh yeah, by the way, you have a time limit in each level. Another part of it that sucks is that without Gilligan, you can't even talk to the other characters. They'll just mention that Gilligan's not with you, and it prevents you from advancing. I guess this gives you a better understanding of the frustration the castaways have with Gilligan after he fucks up one of their escape attempts. But that couldn't have been what they were going for, could it? If so, that's pretty fucked up. One way to avoid ripping the hair out of your head in frustration from all the Gilligan chasing is the rope power-up. If you use it, you'll lasso Gilligan and pull him to your screen. But once you run out of rope, you're fucked, so save up. Another power-up is food, which you can get at any time to boost up your life meter, which is measured in hearts. 10 is your maximum, and you start out with 5, and once you run out, it's game over. But you can continue on the level you left off at, and there's a password system. You can also extend the timer by grabbing hourglasses. All these power-ups seem to appear randomly, so I can't tell you when to grab them in the walkthrough, just grab them whenever they show up. The graphics are okay. They do a decent job of making some of the characters recognizable, while others look about as good as they can in the 8-bit era. And I know it's 2D 8-bit Nintendo, but the character models do have this cardboard cutout look to them that I think could have been a little bit better, and the animation in general is subpar. The backgrounds do look alright, but the problem is that all 4 levels look exactly the same. Sure, the mazes look different, but all there is tropical landscape on the overland and the cave underground. Same shit all 4 levels. It's very monotonous. What else makes the game monotonous are the mundane tasks that you have to take care of. I mean, some of it makes sense, like Marianne gets kidnapped by the headhunters, so you have to go get the club from the professor to kill the main headhunter and get the key. But in between that, Mr. Howell is deep in the bowels of the cave and wants to go for a swim, so he has you go get his bathing suit from Mrs. Howell. What the fuck? I'm the skipper, the commander of the ship. I should be running things here, not running errands for people while there are more important matters to tend to. On top of that, the enemies flat out suck. The land animals just run around hoping to knock you over, the birds swoop down from overhead, and the headhunters just punch and swing their clubs. Not a whole lot of variety there. The true enemy is figuring out the correct sequence of tasks within the time limit, so that might justify the weak enemies, but only if the boss battles could save it, and they don't. They just wander around striking you, and you have to smash them in the head with a club. There's less of a strategic element in these boss battles as there is tying your shoes. Velcro. So even though the controls are decent, between the lame enemies, the lame bosses, and the lame tasks that you have to take care of, the gameplay in this game is pretty, well, lame. Speaking of lame, so is the dialogue. I know that Gilligan's Island has some pretty hokey writing, but my god, they really turned the corner here. Gilligan will say, "I've got a bad feeling about this," to which the skipper replies, "Me too, but I always feel that way when I'm with you." Ugh, and it's constant too. Always the same lines over and over again. And even some of the same jokes and the little cutscenes get repeated. It's all very sloppy. And it would be even sloppier if they didn't give you a map in the pause menu. It monitors where you and Gilligan are at the moment, as well as any other characters you've already run into. If this didn't exist, then navigating your way through this would be a nightmare. One more complaint before I get to the walkthrough. The music sucks. Most of the soundtrack is just flat out annoying. The production quality isn't very good either, so even the rendition of the TV theme song that plays over the title screen isn't all that great. All the notes are just too stabby, it doesn't flow well at all. Speaking of not flowing well, let's take a look at the levels, or episodes. In episode 1, there's a storm coming, so Skipper gives everyone an assignment. The professor to fix the transmitter, Marianne to fix dinner, and the Howls to cut logs to build a hut. Mr. Howell refuses to do manual labor, because he's rich, not because he's old. So Skipper decides to get the logs himself, and has Gilligan pick the spot to build the hut. Start out heading right, the only direction you can go, and maneuver your way between these rocks, or jump over them. These birds will swoop down at you. As long as you're in the air, they can't hurt you, so jump whenever you see one. Landing on the rocks and falling on your ass won't deal you any damage, it'll just slow you down. After advancing to the next screen, head right and it'll lead you to the professor, who says that Mrs. Howell is with Mr. Howell. Okay, that was some vital fucking information. What the hell are you a professor of? So head back out to the intersection you came from and head up. Jump over this ship, avoid the cheetah, and jump into this quicksand. Tap A repeatedly to stay afloat and make your way out. You'll get to the Howells. Mr. Howell says his wedding band is lost and doesn't know where it is, and Mrs. Howell says that the bird took the ring to its nest in the tree. Well, I guess we know now that Mr. Howell has Alzheimer's because his wife, who knows where the ring is standing right next to him, and he still doesn't know. So go back to right before the quicksand, head up, avoid the rocks, and head left. Jump into the water, tap A, and hold left to make your way across the flowing river. It's not easy to reach. If you don't, you'll get washed up down here, and you actually won't be that far from where you're heading anyway. Just stay on the linear path upwards and take the first path up. If you do make it across, keep moving left. If you head down this path, Marianne mentions that there's a tree up ahead with a bird's nest. That's where you want to go, so keep moving left, and the path you want will be right here. Crawl through the quicksand and you'll get to a tree that Gilligan climbs. He finds the ring, so bring it back to Mr. Howell, who gives you a jar of caviar. Mrs. Howell mentions a ghastly sound that she hears where the professor is. Rather than check up on him, she assumes you'll just do it yourself, so head back to the professor, who tells you that the gorilla and the monkey stole the transmitter and headed to the other side of the bridge. He gives you the club to get it back, since as the skipper it's your job to do everything apparently. So head back to where the river was and go right, cross the bridge, and be sure to stay on the same horizontal level as the bridge once you get across, because if you move, Gilligan will move too and fall off the bridge into the underground. You'll have to go down, get him, and you'll have to climb up this ladder and get back on land and find your way back. Otherwise, after crossing the bridge, keep heading right, walk through this quicksand, along with this river of quicksand, which is essentially the same as the regular river. You'll get washed up into the quicksand near the Howells. After this is the boss, the gorilla who stole the transmitter. Smash him in the head with the club. Yeah, that's pretty much it. Just smash his head and he'll pound his chest. Smash his head, he pounds his chest. Keep the head smashing and chest pounding going until he walks over to the corner and leaves the transmitter behind in a treasure chest. But then Gilligan steps on it and breaks it. What a doofus. So bring it back to the professor, who gives you a saw to cut the tree down. So go back to the tree where you found the ring earlier, cut down the tree, and bring the logs back to the spot Gilligan picked to build the hut, which happens to be the beginning of the level. So head back there and the episode is clear. Then you'll get a cutscene where Skipper wakes up Gilligan, pissed off at him because the hut got washed up. Skipper blames Gilligan for picking a spot so close to the water, but shouldn't Skipper or anyone else have said something before? I mean, everyone knew the spot Gilligan picked. Oh well. In episode 2, Marianne gets kidnapped by headhunters, so it's off to rescue the damsel in distress. Start out heading down, and take the next path down to the professor, who wonders where Marianne is. Yeah, thanks again, Professor. There's nothing else down here, so don't even bother going down there. I just wanted to show you another dumbass comment by the professor. When you start out, you really want to head right. Cross the river, avoid this hole surrounded by the rocks, cross this river too, and holy shit, a headhunter. Now's when your punches come in handy, because these pricks will show up here and there throughout the rest of the game. Punch them to stun them and they won't bother you. Sometimes they'll scare Gilligan, I guess, because he'll wander way off to the wall and just walk against it like a moron. You have to go back and get him for him to follow you again. So head down this path after you get across the river, head right and cross the bridge. Jump to avoid the swooping birds. You get to a split, head up, and Mr. Howell tells you there's a stone tablet with native gibberish on it. So lead Gilligan into the hole, head down and left to get the stone tablet. Bring it back to the professor, who can't translate it without his textbook of ancient South Pacific languages, which he's letting Mr. Howell borrow for some bizarre reason. He just said that the tablet had native gibberish on it, so obviously he hasn't been reading it. So go back to Mr. Howell to get the book, but he'll ask you to go get his golf ball that got stuck in the tree across the river, and then he'll give you the textbook. What the fuck, man? Marianne's life is at stake. Time is precious, old bastard. So head down to the other end of the intersection, walk through the quicksand, and take a left here. Punch out any of the headhunters that get in your way, take the second path north, and Gilligan climbs the tree to retrieve the ball. Bring it back to Howell, and he'll give you the textbook. Bring it to the professor, who gives you a club that one of the headhunters dropped. So head back to the river at the start of the level, and let it wash you underground. Smash the headhunters, and keep going straight. Head down this path, smash any more headhunters here, and you'll arrive at the boss, this large headhunter who fights you with his bare hands. You have to hit him in the head with the club. Just swinging it at any spot won't work. He'll knock you on your ass. So stand directly in front of him and bash his fucking skull in. After you get enough shots in, he'll wander over to the side and drop the treasure chest, just like the gorilla did. You'll get the key, which will unlock Marianne's cage, which you can get to by going back here at the beginning of the cave, head up this path, walk through the quicksand, head up at the intersection, and you're there. Gilligan struggles to unlock the cage before Skipper notices that he's putting it in the wrong hole. What the hell kind of joke is this? It's not like these Neanderthals have a real complex locking system. What other hole could they possibly be talking about? Anyway, so after that, you get a cutscene where everyone celebrates Marianne's return, and one of the female island aborigines falls for Gilligan, who wants none of it. So the third episode starts with the professor saying that there's still missing pieces of the stone tablet, which he believes may be a map of the island. So the objective of this level is to get the remaining pieces. Punch out the headhunter here at the beginning and follow the linear path to the right. Avoid the monkeys and head north. At the four-way intersection, head north again, and Mrs. Howell will ask you to go find Mr. Howell, who disappeared. So go back to the intersection, head right, up this way, up again past the fat aborigine that wants Gilligan's junk, and you'll find Marianne and 2 holes. Yeah, I'm not even gonna go there. Talking to Marianne is a challenge here, because they set her up right in between the holes, so it's not that hard to accidentally lead Gilligan into the hole on the right. Marianne just tells you that she thinks Mr. Howell went down one of the holes, so you don't even really need to talk to her anyway. Just go down the left one, after Gilligan of course, and even that process can be tricky with the lack of space to walk. Once you do get down, punch out the headhunters, head up this way and up the ladder, go left and take the first south path you see. Now this river is long, so you're going to want to stand as far up as you can, as close to the edge as you can, jump as far as you can, and tap A as fast as you can. Once you get across, jump to avoid the bats that swoop down, and you'll find Mr. Howell on the next screen, who wants to take a swim and asks you to go get his bathing suit from Mrs. Howell. What the fuck? He disappears, doesn't tell anyone where he's going, his wife is scared shitless, and it's all so he can take a swim in the cave. Senile old fart. So do as he wishes and go back to Mrs. Howell and get the bathing suit. Let yourself get washed up by the river, and head left right after where Gilligan's admirer is located. So get the suit from Mrs. Howell, and go back to Mr. Howell, and he'll give you a piece of the stone tablet. So once again, he held onto a key item and traded it to you for something stupid. You want to give the tablet to the professor, so let the river wash you past the Aborigine Broad, head right, and take the north part of the fork to the professor. He'll give you the formula for the melting solution, which Marianne will make. So let the river wash you back down, head left, avoiding the tigers and monkeys, take a right here, and you'll end up coming back up at the four-way intersection by Mrs. Howell. So go back to Marianne, and she'll say that to make the melting solution, she'll need some nuts. Let the river wash you down here, and head left this time, and go down the hole. Head down this path and keep going left. Walk through the quicksand, watch out for falling chunks of ceiling, stop yourself from going forward if one does fall. Then climb back up to the surface. Head left, and Gilligan will climb the tree and get the nuts. Head right past the pit you climbed out of and keep going till you get to the river of quicksand. Let it wash you down here, head right, and you're back at the four-way intersection at the beginning. Bring the nuts to Marianne. She makes the formula and gives it to you to bring to the professor. When you bring it to him, he'll give you a new piece of the stone tablet and a club. I don't know why he's giving you the piece of the tablet. I thought he was the one putting it together, but oh well. Go back to the area where you climbed the tree, but instead head right, and this time take the southern path down here. Crawl through the mud, avoid the rolling boulders, and you'll meet up with the boss, a bear. Same shit as always, stand in front of him and bash him in the head until he dies. Seriously, there's nothing else I can say here. I guess his strikes are different, so yeah, there's something different that separates him from the other bosses. When you finish him off, you'll get another piece of the stone tablet. Why this bear has it, I'll never know. So that's it for this episode. The castaways then help each other out in putting the pieces of the tablet back together, and it turns out it's just a stone sculpture that Gilligan made and lost a few days earlier. Jackass. In episode 4, Skipper sends Gilligan to catch some fish, and Professor tells everybody else that the native chief told him about a stone idol on the island that grants one wish to whoever finds it. And they kept Gilligan in the dark about it so he doesn't fuck up their chance to wish everybody off the island. Take the first path north you see, head right, go through the quicksand, be careful of these wolves, and head up north across the river to Marianne. She wants to make a pie, so she has you go down the river to get some coconuts. Yeah, the pie is really important in comparison to the stone idol, but whatever. Go down the river, head right, punch out the headhunters, and head down at this four-way intersection. Gilligan will climb the tree and get the coconuts. Go back to where you got washed up, head down here, move left, and you're back at the first northern path you took earlier to get to Marianne. Give her the coconuts, but she can't make the pie without a fire. Then matter-of-factly mentions, oh, by the way, Mrs. Howell has been kidnapped by headhunters, and she gives you a club. Nice. Take the river down, go right, head north at the intersection, follow the linear path to the hole, head right when you come up at this intersection, swim across the river, head north, and climb up the ladder. Follow the linear path and take the first path down south, and you'll fight the headhunter that kidnapped Mrs. Howell. Same fight as earlier. Bash him in the head, and when he dies, you'll get the key. Head down and you'll free Mrs. Howell from her cell, after they rehash the same wrong hole joke from earlier. Mrs. Howell gives you some money as thanks, and asks you to go tell Mr. Howell where she is. So head back 2 screens and continue left and take the first path north to find Mr. Howell behind the quicksand river. Stay low as this river washes you upwards. He'll give you a check for $1 million for saving his wife. Go back to Marianne, who builds a fire by burning the money, and has you tell Mr. Howell that dinner won't be ready for a while. So go back to him, and he'll insist that he's starving and wants a piece of Marianne's pie. So go back to Marianne again, and she'll give you some coconut pie, bring it back to Mr. Howell, and he'll say that Marianne has the secret weapon. Must be quite a secret, because I don't know what the hell he's talking about. So go back to Marianne and she'll give you the secret weapon, which is labeled in the inventory as some type of cross, and says that you must defeat the curse to get the stone idol. So go back to where Mr. Howell is and let the quicksand river wash you up. Head left, carefully walk across this bridge, watch the boulders that roll towards you, and jump to avoid the bats. Head down the pit, watch out for the wild beasts, take the path down at the intersection, head down again, and let the river wash you up to the boss, which is the curse, or skeleton. Once again, this is the same strategy as always. Bash his exposed skull and try to take as little damage as possible. He's more difficult to hit than the earlier bosses, but there's not much else to smashing him over the fucking head, maybe getting some extra shots by hitting him as he gets back up. Eventually you'll kill him and get the idol. Skipper sends Gilligan off to get some fruit for dinner, while Professor says the magic words to get the wish from the idol. While Gilligan's scrummaging for fruit, thinking out loud, he wishes he had a mountain of ice cream, and unknowingly gets the wish from the idol, once again following up everyone's chance to get off the island. It's a wonder they haven't killed him yet. So that's how the game ends, with everyone right back where they were, just like in the show. So then you get some text basically providing a cliffhanger for a future game, which thankfully never happened. And then a montage of some parts from the game while the credits roll. Gilligan's Island is very weak. The combat is ho-hum, the storylines are impossible to take seriously or find funny, the dialogue is gut-wrenching, and the gameplay itself is mundane. To sum it all up, this is not the game you would pick if you were stranded on a deserted island. And that wraps up this edition of Aqualung's Game Reviews. See you next time. I think it's pretty much a given that you know who Mario is. He's the single most recognizable character in video game history. Even people outside of the gaming world know exactly who he is. The first game he ever appeared in was the 1981 arcade hit Donkey Kong. Although he hadn't been properly named yet, he was assigned the generic Jumpman. The object is to save Pauline, the chick in distress, from the evil ape Donkey Kong, who plans on doing who knows what with her. In the Atari 2600 port, there are 2 screens. In the first one, you ascend the level, almost in chutes and ladders form, while leaping over barrels being rolled by Donkey Kong. And in the second screen, you take apart the scaffolding by walking or jumping over the trapdoors in the floor while avoiding the ducks that weave back and forth. They're supposed to be flaming ghosts, but I'm just gonna call them ducks. Once you activate all the switches, you've won. In both levels, you can grab a hammer that you can use for a short period of time to destroy the barrels or ducks. The only thing is, you're prohibited from climbing the ladders at this point. So in the first level, you can only clear a path up to the end of this beam, and in the second level, you can only take out one duck. The point system is a little weird, not so much in attainment, but in display. You would think that the 4-digit number up top would be your point total, but it's not. That's your timer. It starts out at 5,000 and ticks down by the 100, and when it reaches 0, you die. How it works is, the total number left on your timer is added to your point total, which you'll build up from jumping over barrels, breaking them apart, and activating the trapdoors. But why the hell can you never see how many points you have? It really couldn't have been a big deal to show both. Of course, the game isn't going to match up with the arcade version graphically, especially on Donkey Kong. He looks like a red gingerbread man, and Pauline's hair really should have been a different color than her skin. But the visual inferiorities are to be expected. The letdown is that they scrapped 2 of the screens from the original arcade. The thing that sucks in the second level is that the ducks will sometimes change direction out of nowhere, so while you're jumping over them, they'll sneak back under you and you'll land on them and die. The trick is to bait them over by the trap door and leap over them and the door at the same time. Be sure to leave some space between you and the trap before jumping, and leap when you see the duck just make contact with the trap. That way they don't change direction on you. Once you activate the trap, they can't cross the gap, making the other trap in the floor a walk in the park. You end up back at the first stage and go back around the horn. Unfortunately, the difficulty doesn't increase, and there are no difficulty settings to toggle before each game either. Despite all the holes in this ship, this is still an okay game. People will crap on it because it's the weakest version of the original game, but in the end it's still Donkey Kong. A simple but effective classic watered down a bit to accommodate the limitations of a home console. Although they could have squeezed some of the water out of the sponge. Donkey Kong took a pretty innovative direction with its arcade sequel, Donkey Kong Jr. Rather than going through the predictable route and using Mario as the hero once again, Nintendo decided to reverse roles and have you play as Donkey Kong's son, the title character. The story picks up from where the last one left off. Mario saves Pauline and captures Donkey Kong, and now it's up to Junior to save his old man. Coleco's Atari version takes 3 of the 4 levels from the arcade. In the first level, you climb up vines while avoiding the little chompy guys that Mario sends after you. You can climb 1 or 2 vines at a time, each resulting with different speeds. You'll climb faster going up 2 vines and down 1, and you'll travel slower climbing up 1 vine or down 2. But you'll need to shimmy across sometimes to avoid the chompers. You'll die if you make contact with them, or if you land in the water or even hit the ground from a high distance. One thing that sucks about this version is that there's no way to kill these enemies. In the arcade, you could knock fruit down onto them to clear them out of the way and get some bonus points, but it's completely omitted from the Atari version. To beat this level, you have to get to the top platform and grab the rope near Donkey Kong's cage. The second screen has 3 pairs of rope with locks underneath. The goal is to push all 3 to the top to free Donkey Kong from his cage. The chompies will descend down the ropes, and at the bottom is a big-ass bird that flies across the floor. I don't understand why this level comes in the middle. Donkey Kong is released from the cage, so you would think that this would be the end of the game. But this stage comes at the end. You ascend this level similar to the first level in the original Donkey Kong. The chompy bastards come at you in this weird crisscross pattern. You have to be quick to get onto the platform and jump over them, because if you think that you can hang around on the ropes and let them pass under you, you're dead wrong. This level doesn't have the spark guys from the arcade. I guess that's what the chomp guys are supposed to be, since they slide across the floor so fast. If that's the case, they really could have changed the sprites. It wouldn't have been that hard to make sparks. After getting past all 3 levels, you'll be sent back to the beginning with increased difficulty each time. There's also a 2-player alternating mode with 8 adjustable difficulty levels. Donkey Kong still looks like a red gingerbread man. Junior looks kinda like an ape, although he just looks like a pudgy red balding guy in some spots. And Mario came out good again, save for that oversized nose. First level looks bland, but the water gradients looks nice, and the 2 later stages are pretty good translations of their arcade counterparts. One thing that should have been tinkered with is the jumping. Once you jump in any direction, you won't be able to control your movements, you'll just fall straight down. And since you don't get much height in your jumps, your timing has to be pretty precise. If you jump a hair too early, you're fucked. And sometimes it's hard to tell where you can land when climbing off these vines. You think I could get across this platform here, but I end up falling straight down. The Atari port of Donkey Kong Jr. doesn't quite live up to the arcade version, but despite its flaws, it's hardly unplayable. As you get used to the controls, you'll discover it's a decent little game to occupy your time for a little while. There were several hockey games on the NES, but the one that stands out above the rest is Blades of Steel. While other NES hockey games were a bit on the slow and or cartoony side, Blades of Steel was fast-paced and intense. Instead of a direct overhead view from the rafters or a vertical goalie view, you get more of a 45-degree angle perspective. You can play a 1 or 2 player mode with 3 difficulty settings for the computer, and compete in either a single game or 8-team tournament. The game isn't officially licensed by the NHL, but the 8 cities are seemingly represented by their NHL counterparts, although some of the team's colors are way off. Since when is Edmonton green, Los Angeles yellow, and Montreal vomit color? And where the hell's Boston? Come on, we were the first US city to have a hockey team. What a jip. It really doesn't matter who you choose, really. All the teams and players are equal in attributes. So once you get your game mode and your team selected, you're ready to hit the ice. Pressing B will pass the puck, and A fires off a slap shot. Every time you pass the puck, you'll hear this. I can't tell if that's with the pass, watch the pass, makes the pass, eat my ass. Whatever it is, you'll hear it after every single pass, so get used to it. On defense, you'll always be controlling the closest guy to the puck, which is convenient in that you don't have to be constantly pressing a button to select him to keep up with the fast pace, but you do have to keep in mind that the computer will automatically be changing your player, so be ready to change direction. You also control the goalie, which is great, but it can cause a dilemma. If your opponent takes a shot and you save it, the puck will ricochet off you and he can get the rebound and take more shots. So you're left to decide whether you want to keep saving until you catch the puck, which doesn't happen nearly as often as the ricochet, or be more aggressive and try to take him out with the defenseman. Or if you think you're James Bond or something, you can try to control both at once. The computer control players won't help you out much, so either way you have to take matters into your own hands. When shooting the puck, a small red arrow will bounce back and forth across the net. That's the general direction your shot's gonna go. It all depends on the angle you're taking as to whether or not it will hit the target accurately. Obviously you want to shoot when the arrow is away from the goalie, and while you're controlling the goalie you always want to be lined up with it. And although the A button is your slap shot, you can sometimes score in close range by using the pass as a wrist shot. The physical aspect of the game is definitely there as well. You can bump into your opponent and make a steal, and if you hit him good enough, you'll knock his ass to the ice. There's nothing like blasting your opponent with a good check, and there's no roughing or cross-checking penalties, so you don't have to be conservative, just beat the shit out of everybody. Speaking of beating the shit out of people, the most intense part of the whole game are the fights. Sometimes while attempting to take someone down, you'll get into a little scrapple. Sometimes someone gets the better of it and takes the puck, and sometimes a straight-up fight ensues. When this happens, you'll get a close-up view of the combatants. They drop their gloves, and it's on. B punches, A blocks, and the D-pad controls whether the face or body is the target of your punches or protection. The meters up top indicate how much energy you have left. You're going down, you Montreal motherfucker. Yeah, take a seat, bitch. Yeah, isn't it weird how the guy that loses the fight has to sit in the penalty box while the winner goes scot-free? Gives you more incentive to kick someone's ass. You get a freaking power play. The 2 minutes don't last all that long due to the accelerated clock, but since the game is so fast-paced, it does make a difference. If you get into a scrapple while someone's on the breakaway, they're awarded a penalty shot. You'll take a shot from the blue line and use the D-pad to send the puck in one of 6 directions, while the goalie has to react quick and make the save. You'll also encounter penalty shots if you find yourself in overtime, as the 2 teams will duke it out in a shootout. Whoever has the most goals after 5 tries each wins the game. It's cool to have something different, but it's unfortunate that you can't play at least one sudden death period first. A nice novelty addition comes between the second and third period. You'll get to play a mini demo game controlling a jet that takes on a spaceship of some kind. It's a mock commercial, but it also advertises Contra and Jackal, a pair of Konami titles that I think you might recognize. It's a nice bit of icing on the cake, no pun intended. Although if you play another game in the same sitting, the second intermission will just show some lame-ass bear make a slap shot that goes right through the net, literally. He must be on roids. Nice shot sounds like a hidden message to me. When the game is over, the winning team stays on the ice to celebrate and have their picture taken. If you win the finals of the tournament, one of the players carries the cup around. Blades of Steel is a very solid hockey game. It looks good, sounds good, and above all, plays good. When it comes to multiplayer competition, you can't go wrong with Blades of Steel. So, that wraps up this edition of Aqualung's Game Reviews. See you next time.
Shaq Fu was released for the Sega Genesis and Super Nintendo by Electronic Arts in 1994. Michael Jordan had retired the year before, and Shaquille O'Neal was already in the midst of being pushed as one of the NBA's next big young stars. He had endorsements out the ass. He tried his hand at hip-hop, which was horrible, tried his hand in acting, which was worse, and tried his hand at video game endorsement. Now, if someone had mentioned to you at the time that Shaq was going to be featured in a video game, the only genre you'd logically expect the game to be would be basketball, or maybe a street hoops game at the very least. Instead, we end up with a fighting game, which is certainly the next most fitting choice. I mean, everyone in the world recognized Shaq as a martial artist who founded Chiquito. Yeah, I didn't even make that up. That's actually from the game. The SNES version, for whatever reason, only has 7 characters compared to 12 on the Genesis, and also less stages. Other than that, there's not a whole lot of difference. The music is a little bit better on the Genesis. The SNES renditions sound more like unfinished demos, but the graphics and animation are a little sharper on the SNES. The character sprites are small, but well-defined and have pretty fluid animations, as does the detailed backgrounds. But the gameplay, that's another story altogether. The main culprit here are the controls. First off, positioning yourself is a problem. You walk slow, and jumping fucking sucks. You can't control the momentum of your jumps, nor can you change the direction or slow yourself down in midair. So you always travel the same distance every time you jump. All of this makes navigation a nightmare. On top of that, there's a delayed response with your commands, so combining these major issues just leads to a frustrating game of pin the tail on the donkey, but it's more like you're trying to stick the pin on an actual live donkey. Also, you got 2 types of punches and 2 types of kicks, one more powerful and one quicker. Not the most necessary scheme in the world, but it's worse on the Genesis because you only have 3 face buttons, so you have to press start to toggle whether you're doing the punch or kick lineup. It's tedious and disruptive, but I always stick with the kicks anyway. They have more reach, and the A button's function on the punch lineup is to taunt, which does absolutely fuck all, while the A button is a move boost and the kick functions, which enhances attacks or provides a shield for defense. The storyline they came up with eviscerates your brain with hilarious absurdity. Shaq is sightseeing in Tokyo, Japan prior to a basketball game for charity when he wanders into a kung fu dojo, since I guess he wants to showcase his Shikido, or maybe he can't read Japanese and doesn't understand what the sign says. The old man behind the desk immediately proclaims Shaq as the chosen one to rescue the boy Nezu, presumably because Shaq is about 5 feet taller than anyone he's ever seen before. He has Shaq step into a quote-unquote portal that's located in the fucking storage closet out back, taking Shaq into the second world where he must rescue Nezu from Set, an ancient sorcerer who 1,000 years ago ruled the second world, and in an attempt to conquer Earth, overthrew the pharaoh of Egypt until a mutiny of wizards summoned him back to the second world in a comatose state in the form of a mummy, until his most loyal servant, Beast, managed to awaken him, but to regain his strength and continue his world conquest, he needs to perform a ritual on a descendant from the old pharaoh he murdered, so they kidnap Nezu and bring him to the second world. And Shaquille O'Neal, basketball superstar and apparent martial arts expert, who by chance is in Japan at the time all this shit is about to go down, wanders aimlessly into the worst-looking dojo to ever come out of Japan, which happens to double as a gateway into the next world where he can save the day just in the nick of time. Now that's ridiculous in and of itself, but that's just the premise. The way it develops throughout the course of the game adds to the absurdity and creates some confusion. Okay, so how it works is, you walk around the map and choose which opponent you want to face by accessing their location. After clearing everyone at the first level, a bridge will appear and you can move on to the next one. There's some pre- and post-match dialogue that caters to this story, and here's where everything goes from suck to blow. So the kid you're trying to rescue, Nezu, has a grandfather, Liatsu, who is one of the combatants in the first level. For no reason whatsoever, he tries to impede your progress. Why the hell is he fighting you? The cat chick, Corey, who you face off in the second level, is another one of the good guys and fights you because she's been forced to wear a mind control ring. And you also fight Nezu himself in the second level, who has been hypnotized. But no excuse has been made whatsoever for Liatsu to be fighting against you. By the way, I have no idea if I'm pronouncing any of these names right at all. Speaking of Corey and Nezu's mind control situation, here are some more potential plot holes. When you get to the second level, there are 3 fighters you can choose from, and Nezu and Corey are 2 of them. Since you can choose any of them you want in any order, you can face Nezu first, free him from his hypnotization, and then when you face Corey later, the dialogue suggests you're still looking for Nezu. And even if you do free Nezu afterwards, you're still going to fight Beast and Set later on, and they still talk as if Nezu is under their captive. What the hell is happening here? Well, for one thing, this only applies in the Genesis version, as the SNES version has less characters, and Nezu isn't one of them. He's just used as the damsel in distress, if you will. Also, the stage placement is different. Corey appears in the first level, so her encouragement to find Nezu would work even if Nezu was in the second level, which he's not. None of these inconsistencies exist in the SNES version because of this, so it's very likely that for the Genesis version, even though they had to tweak the maps to compensate for the additional characters, they just haphazardly implemented the same sequences without altering the dialogue at all. All they had to do was not include Nezu as an opponent, and it would have taken care of everything. But should we really be breaking our balls over the game's plot? I do have to admit that I do get a chuckle out of the game's ending where, after returning Nezu back to the first world, Shaq hurries to his charity game and finds Beast waiting to challenge him for some hoops. I also gotta say that I do like the game's roster too. I've read a lot of criticisms of the characters being too over the top, but can't you say that about any classic fighting game's lineup? I think the fact that the game was so horrible, the characters were guilty by association. The one thing I don't get for the life of me is Shaq's location. Every fighter has their own venue, kind of like Street Fighter 2. Shaq, the celebrity lead character of the whole game, doesn't even have one. He's defaulted to the fire pits of Beast, which makes sense, you know, Shaq fighting in hell. You'd think a basketball court would be a no-brainer, right? The other options in the game are a duel, which is just an exhibition with 2 players, or a gauntlet against the rest of the game's lineup with 1 player. And each character has their own endgame epilogue bit, which kind of serves as a mini story mode. And finally, there's tournament mode, which is an 8-person tournament you can set up. Shaq Fu is infamously bad, but does it deserve the reputation that it has? Does every copy of the game need to be destroyed, as one website suggested? Well, I don't know about that. It's really bad. It certainly has a case for the worst fighting game of the 16-bit era, and I dare you to come up with one that's worse. But it never drove me to the point of insanity where I had to destroy every single copy in existence. It's a shitty game. I don't recommend it at all. But there are more unplayable games. And that wraps up this edition of Aqualung's Game Reviews. See you next time.
Hollywood Squares was a game show that started in the 1960s and had various stints throughout the last few decades. It was basically a rendition of Tic-Tac-Toe where 2 contestants, representing X's and O's respectively, would answer trivia questions to fill in the boxes. Interestingly enough, the contestants wouldn't be the ones to technically answer the questions. The 9 boxes were occupied by celebrities who had come up with the answers, and it was up to the contestant to agree or disagree with their answer. If your answer matches, you'd get the square. If you guess wrong, your opponent gets it. Then you just follow the rules of Tic-Tac-Toe, getting 3 boxes in a row to win. How would this transfer onto the NES? Well, let's see. First you choose 1 or 2 players. Then you pick your character model, which you only get 4 choices for. Then you enter your name with a 4-digit maximum. Damn, they're really cutting some corners with these restrictions. What could they really be making room for? Well, not much. Once you have your characters, the routine starts. You pick the box you want to fill. The host asks a question. The celebrity tells a lame joke followed by their actual answer. You agree or disagree, and the box is filled according to your answer. Then you start the process over again with the other contestant and take turns going back and forth. That's pretty much the meat and potatoes of the game. You play 3 total games with the winner getting 500 points each. In the event of a stalemate, you each get 100 points for each box filled. After the 3 games are played, whoever has the most points wins the contest and gets a chance to win a car in a bonus game. They'll ask you to pick 1 of 5 keys, and then select 1 of 10 cars. Now, I don't know if your chances are 1 in 50, or if each key has a matching car or what. All I know is it's damn hard to pick the right combination. And it's completely random, so the whole thing is pure luck. There's really not much payoff either. You just get text that says you won. Not even a cutscene with the car driving off or anything like that. There are a decent amount of questions, and some of them are pretty interesting with some intriguing and surprising answers, but you'll eventually see repeats, and that takes away from the reward you would have otherwise gotten from getting a 50-50 question right. Then there's the secret square bonus in the second game you play, where if you get the correct answer on the randomly selected secret square, you win a prize of some kind. And you really get the same ho-hum payoff you get from winning the car, a basic congratulations. And who the hell are these celebrities anyway? I've never heard of them. It's just the same 9 generic schmucks with a different name rotated between them, and their jokes are just as lame as on the show. It would have been a cool novelty idea to use famous Nintendo characters as their celebrities, but that would have cost them some dough, and yeah, this was a pretty cheap game. They probably spent most of their budget obtaining the license to the game show and then just half-assed it the rest of the way. There's not much variety in Hollywood Squares. There are only 3 interactive parts of the entire game. There's the box selection screen, your answer, and the car bonus game if you win. Unless you want to count the name entry and character selection as a feature, but I think that's really reaching out. Oh yeah, and there's the press start button at the title screen if you want to make it sound any more exciting. All in all, this isn't the ideal game show to transfer into a video game. The fun factor level and replay value are both pretty low, and that's really because there's no depth. In the game's defense, there's really not much more they could have added and have it remain authentic to the show. But then what's the fucking point in releasing the game in the first place? It's just so goddamn boring. And that wraps up this edition of Aqualung's Game Reviews. See you next time. Jeopardy is one of the most popular game shows of all time, its current run lasting since 1984. In 1987, GameTech released the first Jeopardy video game for the NES. You can have 1 to 3 players, with optional computer players to fill in the extra spaces if you have any. In 3-player mode, 2 players would have to share a controller with one buzzing into the D-pad and the other using the face buttons. There are 8 characters to select with 3 color schemes for each. Each character model has a different animation for when they buzz in, answer correctly or incorrectly. To say the least, these people definitely have more active reactions than the contestants on the actual show. Who the hell gets this excited just because they buzzed in? The game follows the format of the show directly, with 5 answers in each category, playing through single, double, and final Jeopardy rounds. And there are daily doubles. After buzzing in, you'll get 45 seconds to enter your answer, which may be faster or slower depending on which of the 3 difficulty settings you choose. You get a lot more time to answer than on the show, but don't forget that you have to enter each letter individually with the cursor, so it gives you a fair amount of time to come up with your answer, or really your question since it's phrased in the form of a question. Thankfully though, you don't have to enter what is blah blah blah, that shit's already there for you. One awkward adjustment you have to make comes in the final Jeopardy round if you're playing multiplayer. Because the wager is supposed to be confidential, the game asks all players to enter their wager while their opponents look away from the screen. It's not a big deal, and I guess it's the only method that works, but you've got to have the honor system in place for this. Unfortunately, you can only play the game so many times before eventually finding repeated clues. There are plenty of categories, but if you play the game like crazy, you're eventually going to encounter this problem. For some reason, there's no sign of Alex Trebek anywhere. Not that I really want to see him there or anything, I think he's an arrogant prick, but it would have just made the Jeopardy experience a little more authentic. There were 2 more Jeopardy releases on the NES, the 25th Anniversary Edition, which is really just another batch of questions, and the Junior Edition, which is more targeted to children. Gameplay-wise, they're all exactly the same. As you probably expect, there's not a lot going on in this game. It's not the most exciting thing in the world to play a quiz game. But if you're a Jeopardy fan, or even just a fan of trivia games, Jeopardy will be good to occupy your time, especially with multiple players. And that wraps up this edition of Aqualung's Game Reviews. See you next time. Monopoly is undeniably the most popular board game ever. Since its inception in 1935, hundreds of millions of people have played it. With those kind of numbers, it only makes sense to have a video game incarnation of it, right? Well, let's take a look at how it plays on the NES. Gameplay-wise, it's a very accurate translation of the board game. You move your token around the board, buy properties, and build up houses and hotels with the game's play money. Every single time you break this game out, someone is liable to say something along the lines of, "Gee, I wish this money was real." It's pretty much a given. Personally, I'd rather have all the money from the game of life. Those come in much higher increments. But back to the game here. Everything else is there too. Railroads, community chest and chance spaces, free parking, taxes, utilities, houses and hotels, and of course the jail. To spice things up, they throw in some cartoons that represent the events of whatever space you land on. A shower of money cascades down from landing on Go, cash registers eat up dollar bills during transactions, and when you get out of jail, the Monopoly man, Rich Uncle Pennybags, gets kicked to the curb. It's pretty funny. Also, the chance and community chest cards have been given a little animation for eye candy. The object of the game, of course, is to make everyone else bankrupt and own everything, hence the term Monopoly. Just like in the game, you can play 2 to 8 players with any of them as human or computer. You can even toggle whether they're human or computer in the middle of the game. There are a good chunk of options for customizing your game. You can set the amount of cash to whatever you want for each player. Let's see how high it'll go. Damn, more than I would have expected. Holy shit. Wow, $99,999. Is there any way you could lose if you start out with that much? Now, let's go the other way with it. Damn, you can start right out on the verge of bankruptcy. You can also assign properties, houses, and hotels. And there's also a weird feature called Load a Prepared Game where 8 preset games will be assigned. You can't really tell what they mean. The title of each of these prepared games may give you an indication, but you have to look through the stats to see all the details. If there's one thing Monopoly is famous for, it's the amount of time it takes to complete a game. Even with 2 or 3 people, it can still take a while, and if you have up to 8 players, forget it, the end is nowhere in sight. So you have the option of setting a time limit between 15 minutes and 5 hours, and whoever has the most value at the end of the limit is the winner. All these options gives this game a little bit of depth and some replay value if you want to manipulate the game and go wild. But there's one option they completely slipped on, and that's the ability to use the free parking space as a lottery for collecting all the money taken in from chance and community chest. I know it's an unofficial rule, technically free parking is just a free space, but if you can start with practically $100,000, give yourself whatever properties you want and set a time limit, then you should be able to utilize free parking as a lottery space. Most people that play the game use it for this purpose, so why not? So the game plays pretty identical to the actual Monopoly game for the most part, but the question is it worth buying the cartridge as opposed to the board game? Well, it's a lot more worth it now than it was when it came out, since you can get it for roughly $5 as opposed to in 1991 when it was being sold for, I'm guessing, 40 or 50. It definitely goes by a lot faster than the board game, and you don't have to go through all the bullshit of setting everything up or misplacing pieces or anything like that. But there's just something missing from playing the game virtually. Physically rolling the dice and moving your token around and all that just has a more genuine feel to it. All in all, if you enjoy the game of Monopoly, then this is a fun game to pop in every now and again, especially multiplayer. But there's also the advantage of playing multiple computer opponents, which you can't do by yourself. So that wraps up this edition of Aqualung's Game Reviews. See you next time. Have you ever wanted to play Clue, but didn't feel like going through the trouble of setting it all up? I don't know why, it's a pretty minimalistic setup, but if you do fall into this category, then Clue on Super Nintendo or Sega Genesis is your answer. For those who don't know, Clue is a murder mystery game. The rich tycoon, Mr. Body, has been murdered and you have to determine who committed the murder, what room it was in, and what weapon was used. In reality, it should be easy to figure out what weapon was used based on the bodily wounds, and the room it was in is most likely the room where you found them. But this is where you suspend reality and just enjoy the game. Cards are used to determine the solution to the crime. They're placed in a confidential envelope, and the rest are distributed to all the players. Each card eliminates that subject as part of the solution, so you have to find out what everyone else's cards are. In the board game, you do this by moving your piece around the long corridors of the Body Mansion to one of the rooms. From here, you speculate a possible solution, requiring the room you're in as the room of the murder. And if anyone has one of the cards, they have to show it to you secretly. Using process of elimination, you can narrow it down, and if you think you have the solution, you can make an accusation and check the confidential envelope. But if you're wrong, you're out of the game. Now this would not play well at all in a video game, as everyone would have to look away from the screen constantly whenever someone had to get information on the cards. You do have to do this to check your own cards, but once everyone goes around the table, you really shouldn't have to do it the rest of the game, although you do have the option to. The Super Nintendo incarnation has to be altered a bit from the board game in order to overcome these obstacles. You can still make suggestions to the solution whenever it's your turn by selecting interrogation. Even if you're not in one of the rooms, you can pick any combination of suspect, weapon, and room, and if one of the players has one of the cards, the game will automatically choose one of them to show their proof. Each player can only do this twice per game, so pick your spots. The other way to obtain clues is by moving your piece to one of the rooms and selecting a suspect and weapon to go with that room, just like in the board game. But here, instead of the other players showing the cards they have pertaining to the solution, you'll instead get a clue that may either draw a connection between 2 parts of this potential solution, or maybe you'll just get one of them. For example, if you go into the lounge with Mr. Green and the lead pipe, you'll get a clue that says Mr. Green wasn't in the lounge at the time of the murder. Or you could go into the study with Professor Plum and the rope, and the clue will be that Miss Scarlet was in the study, even though you didn't pick her. These clues all draw connections between the suspect's rooms and weapons, and it's your job to connect the dots and solve the mystery. It's not the best way to play Clue, but it is a different way. Unfortunately, at the time of its release, it was the most expensive way to play Clue, which has always been my beef with video game adaptations of board games. Of course, it's a lot cheaper now. You can usually find it on eBay between $5 and $10, but even though it's a decent game, the board games are still much more enjoyable. There are plenty of editions of it too. My personal favorite is the Master Detective Edition. Not a lot has changed as far as rules are concerned, but it's greatly expanded with more rooms, weapons, and suspects. So if you get a big enough group together, you can have a 10-player game as opposed to 6 like in the original. It's pretty underrated as far as I'm concerned. And that wraps up this edition of Aqualung's Game Reviews. See you next time.
Dr. Robotnik's Mean Bean Machine was released for the Sega Genesis in 1993. It's a falling block puzzle game, very much in the same vein as Tetris, where the goal is to make lines, or in this case beans, disappear. But it actually was originally released in Japan 2 years earlier as Puyo Puyo. When Sonic the Hedgehog 3 was delayed and ultimately split into 2 games, Sonic Spinball was released as a means of feeding the Sonic craze in the meantime. Only 3 days later, Mean Bean Machine was also released. So all of this was done to buy Sega some time for Sonic 3. Let's just take this game that's already made and slap a few Sonic characters where needed. It makes sense too. I mean, Nintendo struck gold with Dr. Mario, capitalizing on the Tetris phenomenon combined with their mascot. So while Sega was needing to pump out some extra Sonic games, this was a good time to put this practice to the test. So the plot is that Dr. Robotnik has kidnapped the beans from Beanville and has been turning them into robot slaves using his bean machine. And by completing these bean matching games, you've stopped his evil plans? I don't know. I guess it's kind of difficult to take this bean puzzle game and come up with a story that makes sense in the context of Sonic the Hedgehog, but who's really paying attention to this shit anyway? Unlike Tetris or Dr. Mario, you're paired off with the CPU opponent in the single-player mode, with each stage being represented by a different Sonic character. Although it actually is similar to multiplayer Tetris, where the first one to reach the top of their grid loses. You can also play against a human opponent, or practice your skills in the practice mode. Similar to Dr. Mario, every piece that drops is a 2-color item, in this case 2 beans lined up side by side, which you can rotate, with the goal of getting 4 of them strung together. And when you're able to get combos, you'll send a wave of empty beans into your opponent's grid, which blocks them from getting any bean chains going underneath it. To get this shit out of the way, you'll need to clear some beans adjacent to these clear beans. The game keeps track of points and time, but there's no time limit, and you can't win on points. The game goes on indefinitely until someone overflows. So while it's all well and good to keep your pile low, you don't want to get too conservative and hit up every 4-bean combination you get a chance to. It's sometimes best to leave room so you can strike some combos and send the clear beans over to the other side. If you dick around for too long, then at some point your opponent is going to send a shitload of clear beans your way and wreak havoc on your grid. And the CPU is no joke. After a few stages, it really starts to get difficult. Speaking of the CPU, I'd like to talk about the character choices here. They're all baddies from the Adventures of Sonic the Hedgehog animated series, most notably Scratch, Grounder, and Coconuts, plus Dr. Robotnik as the final opponent. But there's a whole slew of forgettable characters that may or may not have even been from the show to begin with. But despite this being a spin-off in the Sonic series, Sonic himself doesn't appear in the game at all, not even a cameo. In fact, he's not even implied to be the main character that you're playing as. It's all very vague as to what is happening or who you even are, and as you can probably guess, there's no sign of Tails either. That being said, it probably would have been very tacky and contrived if Sega tried to throw together some kind of Sonic-esque platformer bonus level or some shit. It just would have thrown off the flow of the game, so I'm more than okay with the way they decided to format this. Not to mention that this wasn't advertised as a Sonic game. Like if it were called Sonic the Hedgehog vs. Dr. Robotnik's Mean Bean Machine or something, then I would be pissed at the flagrant false advertising. But it doesn't do that. It's always been presented as a side project, even more so than Sonic Spinball was. So while the game isn't going to win any points for originality, and it can get frustrating in the single-player mode, it's still an under-the-radar, addictive little game, especially in multiplayer mode. And that wraps up this edition of Aqualung's Game Reviews. See you next time. Donkey Kong Jr. Math was released in 1983 on the Famicom, and then 3 years later on the NES in North America and Europe.
The game was an attempt to educate kids through the vehicle of something that they enjoy doing. In this case, a popular arcade game, Donkey Kong Jr. It sounds fairly logical on paper, although you could definitely make the argument at the time, even without hindsight being 2020, that this was a terrible idea. So the objective of the main game is to reach the number that's held up by Donkey Kong. Playing as one of two competing DK Juniors, you'll climb the vines and make contact with the number, as well as the mathematical signs on the bottom platforms as a means to solve equations to reach said number, essentially making Junior a walking calculator. So, for example, if Donkey Kong is holding up 75, then you'd go to the 9, then go to the multiplication sign, and then 8 to get to 72, and then plus 3, bam, you've got your 75 and you win. While you can compete with a human opponent, there is no CPU mode, so if you're playing with yourself, which I'm doing in this video, you've got zero competition, and it's really just a matter of how fast you can solve the problem. Once you hit your number, you've won the round, and the first 1 to 5 rounds wins the overall match. While this mode is quite boring in single-player mode, there is another mode that's made for single players called Exercise. Here you climb chains to hit correlated numbers to solve a problem up on the board. Somehow it's even less compelling than the main game when playing by yourself. There is another variation of the main mode where you have to reach bigger numbers, so since every number on the vines are single digit, you usually have to take longer routes to get to the final number. But at the end of the day, whether it's 1 player, 2 players, main game, exercise mode, it doesn't matter. It all sucks. An educational game can be fun if the game is actually fun to play. Take Oregon Trail, for example. The educational element from the game is kind of minimal, but it's still there. And the reason why people played it and continue to play it and enjoy it even to this day is because it's actually fun. I'm not trying to downplay the importance of education, and I'm not saying that the balance should be tilted that much in favor of entertainment over education. It's just that the game has to be good, and you don't have to paint the whole educational tag in order to teach. Donkey Kong Jr. Math isn't even really all that educational anyway, because it's not really teaching you anything, it's just giving you more arithmetic practice. And if the gameplay was even mildly interesting, then maybe it would justify the game's existence. But unfortunately, Donkey Kong Jr. Math may have been the botched career move that ruined Junior's legacy. Since this game, he's only made sporadic guest appearances and cameos, while Diddy Kong has taken his place as the younger Kong. However, there are reports in Donkey Kong canon that suggest that the adult Donkey Kong in games like Donkey Kong Country is actually Junior all grown up, but some of these backstories contradict each other, and there doesn't seem to be any kind of official consensus. Plus, I mean, who really looks at Donkey Kong in these games and sees him as Junior and not Donkey Kong? So Junior kind of faded into relative obscurity after this, similar to Pauline, also from the original Donkey Kong run. So did this math game really have any kind of an impact on that? Nah, but it is unfortunate that this was his last confirmed starring role.
Duck Hunt was released in 1984 for the Famicom in Japan, and a year later as a launch title for the NES in North America. It required the NES Zapper Light gun, which was included with the bundle pack that featured the NES itself, a 2-in-1 pack-in cartridge of Super Mario Bros. And Duck Hunt, plus the gun. It's very basic. Your job is to shoot down the ducks that fly about the screen, and hit the quota for each round in order to pass on to the next one. There are 3 different modes to select. In Game A, there's 1 duck on the screen at a time. Game B, there's 2 at a time. And Game C is clay pigeon shooting. You get 3 bullets per sitting in all 3 modes. If you run out of bullets, or if you take too long, the duck or ducks fly away, and if you don't hit any ducks at all in said sitting, your asshole dog that chases the ducks into the sky will laugh at you. Even when you do kill the ducks, he's kind of a douche. He has this look on his face like, hey, you actually got one. I don't share the disdain many people have against this dog. In reality, it's a pretty stupid impulse to allow an 8-bit mutt to get under your skin because you missed your targets in a virtual shooting game. But I've been a victim of it too. He's obnoxious as all hell. As you advance through the game, the difficulty increases as the ducks get faster, and your minimum quota per stage gets bumped up from time to time. Clay shooting is similar to the other 2 modes in terms of the format. 3 bullets per sitting, hit your quota, and move on to the next round. But here you've got clay pigeons that shoot off into the distance, and there are always 2 at a time. This is also a sanctuary if you feel bad about killing these virtual 8-bit animals, although good luck in not wanting to shoot the dog during a heat-of-the-moment bout of frustration. It's a good thing they don't deduct bullets for trying that shit. There's not a lot to speak of graphically. There are only 2 screens, the duck screen and the clay screen. Neither of them change, and they're both pretty plain, although this is an NES launch title, and a lot of these games at that time had limited screens that never scrolled, so it is what it is. The difficulty of the game really depends on how far away from the screen you stand, so if you want to compete with someone and offer a handicap, there's your method. You'll have to alternate after a game over though. There's no real 2-player mode, which would have been great for a simultaneous co-op or a competition. Would have given a whole new element to the game, but that would also require a second light zapper. There is kinda sort of a 2-player mode in a sense, but it only applies in game A, where another player can control the movement of the duck with the control pad. There's no way in hell Duck Hunt would be as big a nostalgia piece as it is, had it not been for its association with Mario, but to no fault of its own, that's how it turned out. And as limited and repetitive as the game is, in the end, it's still good for exactly what it was meant to be, a quick little arcade shooter. And that wraps up this edition of Aqualung's Game Reviews. See you next time. I've always loved customization options in video games. Features like character design, stage design, manipulation of the environment, shit like that. Anytime the ability to personalize the game and take control is present, I'm on board, or at the very least interested. So when I first saw the trailer for Super Mario Maker back in 2015, I said, holy shit, that is awesome. And the next thing that came to my mind was, I really hope that this game is successful so we see other franchises getting their own stage creation platforms. I mean, how great would it be to have Maker editions for games like Sonic the Hedgehog, Castlevania, and even non-side-scrollers like Mike Tyson's Punch-Out? You know that it would be fun to design the fight pattern of a boxer and then see what other people online have come up with. Now, those of you who have watched enough of my videos in the past probably know that I'm a big fan of Mega Man, particularly the classic series. They're my personal favorite NES games, and as a 7-8-year-old kid when the games were coming out, I used to bust out the Crayolas and draw my own stages, my own Robot Masters, the whole fucking 9. So I'd be full of shit if I didn't admit that I wanted a Mega Man Maker as soon as I laid eyes on Mario Maker. So last July when I saw the trailer for the fan-made Mega Man Maker, or Mega Maker as it was originally named, I shit a brick. I was nervous though. I mean, this was an unofficial, free-of-charge third-party game, so there may be a lot of flaws, bugs, it may not even play or feel like a Mega Man game. So I wasn't expecting the world of it. I figured if there were a limited amount of tools to play with, and it felt close enough to playing a Mega Man game, then I'd be more than happy, especially since the game was free. I mean, even a shitty game is a good deal when it's on the house. So I'm not going to be critical of this game in the same vein as I would of one by a major developer. This is more of a grassroots campaign, so it's not really so much a review as much as it is an overview. Also keep in mind that updates for this game are uploaded at a very reasonable pace, so this will only cover the most recent version, which at the time of this recording is version 1.3.6. So yeah, at the time that the game was launched, there were a limited amount of tools to play with. Unlike Mario Maker, where you can design stages based on the original Super Mario Bros., Super Mario Bros. 3, Super Mario World, or New Super Mario Bros., in Mega Man Maker, your only option is the 8-bit series. But that's fine by me. That's always been my bread and butter of Mega Man games. Not to mention that enemies, tile sets, bosses, and power-ups from all the original 6 are represented. Plus, since updates continue to be released, where new enemies, bosses, backgrounds, weapons, tile sets, etc. continue to be added. Not to mention that the bugs are fixed and functions tweaked to continuously improve upon the game, and even some enemies and features from Mega Man games outside of the original 6 are sprinkled into the mix every once in a while. There are even some original weapons. You get a blank palette of 50 screens horizontally by 20 screens vertically, giving you a grand total of a potential 1,000 screens for the level, which is insane considering an average Mega Man stage lasts about 20 to 25 screens. There are several icons in the user-friendly interface that represent your tools.
From here you can select up to 12 special weapons that are available in the stage, and you can even add a weapon pickup item, so you don't start with it right away, or even any weapons at all, and you have to find them somewhere in the stage. You can also throw in locked doors that you have to find keys to unlock, which literally opens the door up to many options for your stage like puzzle solving and shit. And as of the most recent update, you can now play as Proto Man and Base. Each of the character's specialties like Proto Man's shield and Base's double jump are not only present, but they're also optional. You can include charge shots, the ability to slide, or you can just take all of these off and play Mega Man 1 and 2 style. Every stage theme from the first 6 Mega Mans are featured, including the Wily themes, and you can also select the boss music. A lot of the weapons have been improved upon from the originals, like the top spin lets you smash enemies as you land on them, Bomb Man's bombs hurt enemies upon impact instead of waiting for them to detonate, and certain shield weapons let you walk across spikes. You can have your bosses immune or weak to any of the weapons you've selected, so you don't have to rely on defaults. You also get infinite lives, so you don't have to worry about any game overs. Once you hit a checkpoint, which you can place wherever you want, and up to as many as you want, you're good from there. To compensate for the lack of a need of extra lives, the 1-up item now restores all of your health. When uploading a level, you have to complete it successfully in order for it to upload into the server to avoid trolling. When browsing online levels, you can sort the stages based on how recent they were uploaded, how high or low that they're rated. You can have the game select one at random for you, or you could use the search engine. One thing I would like to see added to the online levels are a count of how many thumbs up and thumbs downs you've gotten, similar to the likes and dislikes on a YouTube video. Because if your score is a 0, it's like, does that mean you've had 1,000 likes and 1,000 dislikes? Or none at all? You can't tell, other than to take a guess based on how many total plays you have, but that doesn't always translate. Also, in a similar vein as a YouTube video, I love to see the function of comments on stages, just to get some feedback and constructive criticism, etc. Because aside from posting on forums and asking other players to try your stage, you're not going to get any depth on how other players feel about your stage. I've always clamored for more 8-bit Mega Man. I can never get enough. When I first discovered hack ROMs, I was happy. When Mega Man 9 was released under the retro format, I was thrilled, mainly because there would be new Robot Masters and weapons. But now with Mega Man Maker, there's a never-ending plethora of 8-bit Mega Man madness. There's a lot of fun to be had in crafting a stage, as well as playing other people's stages. The possibilities are nearly endless, and with the vast amount of stages that have been uploaded, and the continuation of updates, the endlessness of variety will always be there so long as this game is in existence. The one feature that would put this game over the edge would be to create your own Robot Master and special weapon. That would just take things to a whole nother level. Maybe someday. The game is a forever work in progress, so I keep my fingers crossed. And that wraps up this edition of Aqualung's Game Reviews. See you next time.
Mega Man Soccer is actually a game. And it's not some kind of weird situation where the title is misleading or poorly translated. No, this is actually soccer featuring Mega Man characters. Released on the Super Nintendo in 1994, it has to be one of the strangest spin-off side project ideas I've ever heard of. Although the expectation, I'm sure, is for this game to essentially be a wacky, cartoonish, arcade-style soccer game with robots wiping each other out with special weapons on their way to scoring a goal, we instead get a fairly realistic sim arcade hybridish kind of thing. There are special attacks, though. You couldn't have killer robots playing around with a ball the whole time, could you? There's an element of strategy too, as different players have different attributes, and there are multiple formations you can choose from, not to mention making substitutions at halftime. A strange thing though is the inability to completely customize your team. In exhibition mode, you can select between 20 characters, including Mega Man, Proto Man, and many of the Robot Masters from previous Mega Man games. But the player you take for a specific position is copied all the way across the board. I don't want 2 airmans, or airmen I guess, to play as my defenseman. I want 1 airman and 1 of somebody else. It's one thing to be able to play using clones, but in this game you're fucking obligated to.
In the championship mode, which I'll get into in a little bit, you have to start the game with your team entirely made up of all Mega Man. There is a reason for this though. In this mode, you pick an opponent, similar to traditional Mega Man games. Your opponent will have his own team partially made up of clones. Once you defeat him, you'll recruit him onto your team, kinda like how you take their special weapon. Once you get through all of them, your team is fully assembled and you move on to the final games, similar to the Dr. Wily levels. It's unique, but still odd. What's even more odd is the fucking plot behind this. Yes, there is a story here. A regular soccer match is invaded by Dr. Wily's robots. Why? Nobody seems to know. But Mega Man needs to come to the rescue. But Dr. Light, sensing Mega Man can't defeat all the robots on his own, even though he has so many times in the past, reprograms him into a fucking soccer player so he can beat them in a game. That'll show him. They don't explain all the frickin' cloning though, but as Nigel Tufnell would say, that's a mystery best left unsolved. There's also a league mode where 8 teams play each other in round-robin format, and an 8-team tournament mode. Now for the gameplay itself, it's alright. You have pretty good control of the players, the graphics are really good, and there's a lot of variety with the scenery. There's quite a few fields with various themes. But with the quote-unquote camera so close to the action, you do find yourself looking up at the map too often to find a nearby teammate to pass it to. And on defense, you're having to shuffle the buttons on the D-pad to find the nearest player on your team when the ball gets passed. So while there is a sense of strategy in the areas I previously mentioned, these flaws lead to some button mashing, kicking the ball aimlessly and hoping for the best. The soundtrack is pretty good too. I mean, there are no iconic songs on here at all like in the classic Mega Man soundtracks, but it's a good fit for the game. It doesn't hold my interest long enough to warrant playing through a whole season of the League mode or anything like that, but it's a fun little novelty game that's good for a change of pace, particularly against a human opponent. And that wraps up this edition of Aqualung's Game Reviews. See you next time.
Color a Dinosaur. When you hear the title, the first thing that probably comes to mind is, do you do anything besides color dinosaurs? Well, nope. All you do is color dinosaurs. The title screen right here is pretty much the entire game. You color a dinosaur using a shitty selection of colors and patterns, and that's it. Wow, that was a pretty short review, wasn't it? Well, let's see if I can break this game down a little bit more. Although with the depth this game has, this will be like trying to break down a microscopic crumb. The first screen gives you a choice of 16 cartoony dinosaurs to color. After making your selection, you get the drawing screen. Your color choices are on the left and can be cycled through by pressing the B button. And you get a pencil tool to select the area you want to fill. Now, if you press A at the select screen, you'll use the D-pad to scroll the pencil by each area, and if you press B to select your dino, you can move the pencil around freely. So there are 10 color options, but why is it that 3 of them are actually colors, and 7 of them are just shitty patterns recycled from 80s black and white computer paint programs? And it's so nice to have white as an option too. Since everything already starts out in white, it's really useful. Okay, let's give this guy some light blue for the body. Oh man, these programmers were lazy. Could they not have made the colors fill instantaneously? Man, I don't know what to use for colors. These choices suck. Well, if you press select, you can change the color palette. There are 8 different palettes, but it's really more like 4, with an option to have some of the colors blinking. Yeah, that's real easy on the eyes. And despite the fact that you can change colors, you can only use one palette at a time. So if you use orange here, the top color, and you press select to change palettes, everything that's orange gets replaced by whatever the top color is. And every single palette is riddled with 3 whole colors and 7 retarded looking patterns. When coloring your dinosaur, you're probably going to feel the need to use one of these patterns so it doesn't look so monotonous. But look how stupid that looks. No matter what combination of colors you use, your dinosaur is going to look like shit every time. Another thing that really sucks is that there's no way to save your work. Just look at what you've created and say goodbye to it within 5 seconds. Now this game is supposed to be essentially a coloring book for little kids, only in this coloring book, you get the shittiest box of crayons of all time at your disposal,
And once you're done coloring, you have to rip the page out of the book and throw it away. Not to mention the fact that you can only color dinosaurs. Why not add some other animals to color too? Why does it have to be just dinosaurs? I guess variety wasn't on the minds of the game designers. And here's the entire list of them, all 9 people that worked on this game. And that, my friends, is everything that Color a Dinosaur has to offer. I know that it's for little kids, but this game suffers from a major lack of features. If you want your kids to color, please go out and buy an actual coloring book and a box of crayons. Not only is it a lot more fun, but you're not limited to a shitty color selection and basic rules like staying in the lines. Plus it's a lot cheaper. And if you want your preschooler to try out video games, stay away from this one. Even Atari 2600 games like Big Bird's Egg Catch and Cookie Monster Munch were much more playable and enjoyable, and had a lot more to it. And this was on an inferior console. Color a Dinosaur came out in the twilight years of the NES, and it may be the worst game in the entire NES library. I can't really think of any that are much worse than this. So that's pretty much it. See you next time.
April 15th, 1987 marked the day I turned 4 years old. It was also the day I was introduced to video games. For my birthday, I received an Atari 2600 and 2 games, Pac-Man and Donkey Kong. If I ever have kids, which I doubt will happen, I'm introducing them to the Stone Age games so they can establish an appreciation for the pioneers before they play anything modern. Anyway, enough bullshit about me and my outlook on family values. Like I said, Pac-Man and Donkey Kong were the first 2 games I ever played, so why not start my Atari reviews off with them? I'm going to do Pac-Man first, because it was the first of the 2 that I played. Now if you don't already know, Pac-Man was a phenomenon. It ate up so many quarters that you could take all the metal from all of them and make a whole army of Metal Gears. You control a yellow ball-faced thing that maneuvers around a maze eating up dots. 4 ghosts will chase you around the maze. Contact with any of them will cause you to perish. In the 4 corners of the maze are power pellets which will turn the tables and allow you to eat the ghosts for a short period of time. When you eat them, they'll turn into a set of eyes and go back to their little home in the middle until your invincibility wears off. The object is to eat all the dots in the maze, including the power pellets, and then you advance to the next one. Well, sort of. You advance to the exact same fucking maze you were just in. That's right, there's only one screen in the whole game, and the one maze they give you sucks. It's so monotonous and boring and real easy to find your way through. Pac-Man doesn't even have a sprite facing up or down, he just shifts to his side. There might be a ghost coming, but he doesn't give a shit. He'll see it out of his peripheral vision, I guess. The ghosts aren't exactly easy on the eyes with their constant flickering, and when you eat the power pellet, their color scheme causes them to almost blend in with the background. The absence of fruit that would bounce around the maze as bonus points is a glaring omission. With all the corners they cut, you'd think they'd at least be able to put the fruit in the game. One kind, at least. Man, this game has rush job written all over it. There are 8 difficulty settings, which change the speed of you and or the ghosts, and are 2-player alternating mode. But other than that, there's not much variety, which is where the game suffers the most. It's really not a terrible game, the controls are good and the gameplay is decent, but it does get old fast, and it's a real shitty adaptation of a colossal hit, which is why this is such a letdown. By itself, it's a generic, average, run-of-the-mill maze game, but because this was the granddaddy of maze games, and the arcade version kicked so much ass, your expectations are very high. You don't want the home version to be a generic garden variety disappointment. Despite all the negative reactions this game received, it actually sold really well, mainly due to its name alone. The problem was they made so many goddamn copies that they ended up with a lot of leftover unsold inventory, which helped contribute to the game market crash in 1983. The 2600 finally got it right with Ms. Pac-Man and Junior Pac-Man sequels, but Father Pac-Man was forced to be associated with this ho-hum release. Okay, so Pac-Man on Atari 2600 sucked balls, no pun intended. It was plain, generic, bland, vanilla, any adjective you can think of to describe meh. It hurt the video game industry greatly by costing Atari millions of dollars in unsold inventory. The arcade sequel Ms. Pac-Man added some features to the original game, but the ported version on the Atari just blows its 2600 predecessor out of the water. The basic format stays the same. You'll go through a maze, eating up dots, avoiding ghosts, while munching on power pellets for temporary invincibility with the main goal to clear the maze. But there are vast improvements in just about every aspect. The graphics are a lot better for one thing. Ms. Pac-Man looks much sharper than the blocky Pac-Man, and the ghosts stand out much better and don't have that annoying flicker nearly as much. The maze layout isn't so redundant either, not to mention that there are 4 different mazes, unlike the lone maze of the first game. How it works is you'll play through the first maze twice, then the second maze twice, and so on and so forth. The fruit that bounces through the maze will change each level. There's cherries, strawberries, oranges, apples, pears, bananas, and pretzels. Pretzels? Boy, that sure blends right in with all the fruit. Anyway, after the 7 fruits go through its rotation, they start going through a semi-random sequence. And when you've gotten through the 4 mazes twice each, they'll also rotate through a semi-random sequence. Each level you progress, the ghosts get faster, and the amount of time for invincibility gets shorter. There's also 4 difficulty settings, which changes the amount of ghosts on screen from 1 through 4. The overall arcade feel that didn't transfer to the Pac-Man cart definitely made its way into Ms. Pac-Man. Everything from the controls, graphics, design, everything transfers to the 2600 perfectly. Even slight improvements such as making sprites of Ms. Pac-Man facing up and down rather than just side to side help filter out the errors found in Pac-Man. So if you have an Atari, enjoy playing Pac-Man, and were disappointed in the letdown that was the 2600 version of the original game, then Ms. Pac-Man is definitely a must-have for your collection. Pac-Man was a revolutionary arcade game that paved the way for many, many maze games in the 80s. The Atari 2600 version was crap. The arcade version of Ms. Pac-Man was even better than its predecessor, and the Atari version did justice to its counterpart, despite the console's limitations. Then Junior Pac-Man came onto the arcade scene in 1983. It was released by Midway without Namco's permission, and so the game technically isn't recognized as part of the Pac-Man franchise. The only port was released on the Atari 2600 in 1987, long after the prime of the console. As the title would suggest, you're Pac-Man and Ms. Pac-Man's son, Junior Pac-Man. The gameplay is essentially the same as its predecessors, only Junior Pac-Man has an animated helicopter hat on his head, and the bouncing fruit is replaced with toys and such. Instead of chasing apples and oranges, Junior's bouncing targets consist of a bicycle, a kite, a drum, a balloon, a train, a glass of root beer, and I think that's a cat. Unlike the other Atari versions where the entire maze is on the screen at one time, the mazes in this game are much bigger so they scroll up and down. The game moves a lot faster too, even in the easier difficulties, which just changes the amount of ghosts from anywhere between 1 and 4. The faster pace combined with the scrolling screen might not be for everyone, as I remember my mother being a big fan of Ms. Pac-Man, but Junior Pac-Man made her dizzy. So I guess this reaction just depends on whether or not the player gets nauseous easily. Now, like I said, the game is pretty fast, and you might even say that it's a little bit too fast. I personally think that the speed could have been tweaked a little bit, but it's really not a big deal. One thing the high speed does is make the ghosts a lot harder than on Ms. Pac-Man, especially since more than 50% of the maze isn't in view. But if the difficulty is a problem for you, adjust the settings to take the ghost count down. A minor addition are the larger pellets that show up in some spots that'll slow you down. And now the invincibility power pellets won't always be placed in the obvious 4 corners. They got pretty creative with this one. The mazes are colorful, have excellent design, and instead of having each of them repeat once, forcing you to beat 2 levels of the same maze before you see a new one, this time each level will be a completely new maze. There's only 1 maze in Pac-Man, 4 in Ms. Pac-Man, and now 7 in Junior Pac-Man. It's really hard for me to say whether or not this is truly better than Ms. Pac-Man. I guess it depends on which pace you like more, how much of a challenge you're after, and whether or not the moving screen will inspire you to vomit. Both games are fantastic and accurate ports that do justice to the legendary franchise, while the first one just plain sucked. After appearing as both the protagonist and antagonist in Donkey Kong and its sequel, Donkey Kong Jr., respectively, Mario moved on to star in his own series and recruited his younger brother Luigi for his first game appearance too, in Mario Bros. This arcade game was ported to several consoles, including this one, the Atari 2600 version in 1983. The premise is that Mario, who's still portrayed as a carpenter, and his brother Luigi have a serious problem. The water pipes in their house are being clogged up with nests of pesky creatures. So they take it upon themselves to wipe out all these pricks one by one. To take them out, you have to smash them from the floor underneath, and while they're momentarily dazed, hop up and knock them off the screen. I did say momentarily dazed, so that means you have to do this quick or they'll spring back up. There's the iconic Koopa Troopers, who at this point were called Shell Creepers. They just walk around, your basic low-level enemy. The Sidesteppers are crabs you have to bump twice to knock unconscious. After the first shot, they'll speed up, so don't do this when they're close to the edge or you won't have enough time to get both shots in and he'll be faster. And finally, there's the fighter flies that hop around. The only time you can knock these guys over is to bump them when they're on the floor. These are the enemies you have to kill to move on to the next round. But they're not the only hazards. There's also fireballs that shoot their way across the screen, and slip ice, this bastard that freezes up the floor, making travel more difficult. You can take out slip ice, but the fireballs are invincible. Slip ice will start showing up in the later levels, while the fireballs are there pretty much the whole time. You can play with 1 or 2 players. In multiplayer mode, you can either cooperate to advance as far as you can together, or you can compete for the higher score and utilize underhanded tactics like knocking a disabled enemy back onto its feet while the other player is about to knock them off. This makes for some potential backstabbing if you want to convince the other player that you're on their side, lull them into a false sense of security, and then Pearl Harbor them. Even if you work together, your selfishness may come to the forefront because 20,000 points will reward you with an extra life. So if you're cooperating, you have to make a decision on whether or not to let the player with less lives get a majority of the points to get his lives back, or just simply play it out like normal and let natural selection run its course. You get points from bumping off enemies, but after every few rounds you'll get a coin bonus, although they look more like blue orbs than coins. You have 15 seconds to collect all of them, so once again you have your options in the 2-player mode about being cutthroat or functioning as a unit. Every time you knock an enemy off screen, this flashy thing that's supposed to be a wafer will show up. Grabbing it will give you some extra points, and both the wafer and knocking enemies off screen will result in 800 points, so there's no advantage to wiping out the enemy or eating the wafer. In fact, if one player is better at taking out enemies and you want to work as a team, you can have one person stationed lower to knock the enemies on their ass and eat the wafers that show up, while the other finishes the job on all the disabled enemies. There's also a rectangular block down here called the POW block. Smashing it will knock all the on-screen enemies on their ass, but you can only use it 3 times every 10 rounds, and it's not exponential either. After the 10th round, when it resets, it's still 3 times maximum. It won't add 3 to whatever total you have. The best bet is to use this when there are a lot of enemies on the screen and you think you might have trouble knocking them over without getting hit by something else. There aren't any difficulty options. The only variations you can choose is 1 or 2 players, start with 3 or 5 lives, and you can turn the fireballs on or off. The controls are responsive, but there's a few issues that could have been tweaked. For example, you can't change your direction in midair while jumping, and if you get a running start, your trajectory is always the same. And jumping is a huge part of this game, so the stiffness in the jumping controls should have been tightened up a bit. And when you stop yourself while running, you'll glide considerably, making the surface feel very slippery. Speaking of running, the sound of your footsteps is pretty irritating. It sounds like a pack of wild horses galloping across a pavement road. Is that necessary? It's no big deal, but it can wear on you if you don't have a high tolerance for that kind of thing. Another shortcoming is there's only one screen. The enemies change shifts, but the platforms are always laid out the same. But that doesn't make the game monotonous. There's enough variety in the enemies, and their increased speed as the game goes on along with the fireballs will keep you on your toes. And the bonus coins, wafers, and POW blocks add a few spices to keep things interesting. It's not a perfect port, and it's not the deepest game in the world to begin with, but it's a fun little platformer that established Mario as a lead character, setting the stage for bigger things to come.
The popular Star Fox series didn't get its start in the 1993 classic for the SNES. It actually began 10 years earlier on the Atari 2600. Well, not exactly. Yes, it is a shooter, and it does have the Star Fox title, but that's it. The game was long forgotten, and the Super Nintendo games started the series anew, leaving this game in the dust. Why was that the case? Because it's fucking terrible. You fly a ship around with the objective of collecting as many of these crystals as you can, while blasting away these other ships. First off, the gameplay moves at about 1,000,000 miles an hour too many. Keeping complete control is impossible, especially since you move so fast that you outrun the screen and can't see in front of you. But that doesn't matter too much, because this is one of the few games in existence where making contact with the enemies kills them instead of you. How about that shit? It's nice to be on the other side of the coin for once. Too bad the one game where it lets you utilize this practice is a piece of shit. The only way you can die is by getting shot by the enemies. You can plow into them or shoot them, and by holding down the fire button, you'll have a constant shot. So you might as well just stick with that. There's no ammo count or anything. But this is on the normal difficulty setting. In hard mode, you will die from enemy contact. And here it's such a struggle just to line up with your enemy in order to get a shot off. There's no control whatsoever.
There's always only one enemy on the screen at one time, and they don't really change up much. Redundant doesn't even begin to tell a story. Picking up crystals is another issue. You have to dive into the orange portion of the screen down below to pick them up, but you can't move side to side in this situation, and somehow the crystals have a mind of their own and try to get away, so you have to snag them quickly, which is no easy task. When you're down here, you're vulnerable to bombers, which gives you another reason to get the hell out of there quickly, because they won't hesitate. And then you find yourself at a point where it seems like you're beating the game because nothing is happening. There's no crystals to pick up, no spaceships to shoot. What the hell am I doing? Oh wait, I guess there are some signs of life here. What the hell was with that delay? Another issue with the controls that I didn't mention earlier is how you'll automatically back up a few feet every time you stop. It's stupid and feels so unnatural. If anything, you'll usually find it the opposite problem in games where you'll slide forward a bit after stopping. Nope, Star Fox throws the rulebook out the window and backs you up. If all this shit weren't enough, the sound has got to be the most irritating in the history of video games. I mean, just listen to this shit. I'd rather listen to Hanson. The graphics are nothing to write home about either, but that's the least of the game's problems. If you're not convinced that this game is garbage, then give it a try. Thankfully, this game was indeed kicked to the curb when the Star Fox series legitimately started. The legacy would have been forever tarnished. Dig Dug was released in the arcade in 1982 and was ported to several consoles, including the Atari 2600 a year later. You play as a miner, underground digger, not underage person. Your goal is to dig tunnels in the ground and wipe out the monsters that dwell down below. These monsters I speak of are the Figars, who breathe fire, and the Pukas, who expand like blowfish. Both of these creatures can also transform into ghosts, which allow them safe passage through the walls. Your means of disposal is either the utilization of an air pump that inflates your nemesis until it explodes, or by digging underneath a rock that'll fall onto an adversary down below. You get more points for taking out the enemies on the lower layers of dirt than up top, and high numbers of points lead to bonus lives, so it's something to keep in mind. After taking out all but one monster, the last one standing will run away like a little bitch. If you take it out before it escapes, you win the level, and if it does escape, you win the level anyway. So it's really just a difference in point total at the end of the day. It's one of the most unusual choices of direction in a video game that comes to mind as far as finishing off a stage. Another bonus is a vegetable that'll appear sporadically at the spot where you started your dig. It's similar to Pac-Man, only it's veggies instead of fruit. But you have to swoop in on it quick because it'll only appear for a short period of time. There are two difficulty settings. Normal mode, which follows the conventional formula where the game gets more challenging and the speed picks up from stage to stage, and easy mode, which only includes 2 enemies, and the level continuously repeats. This mode is geared toward beginners and young children. Besides these difficulty modes, there aren't any other variations, but you do get infinite continues, so you don't have to bother with the chore of going back and playing through all the easy levels again after you get a game over. Dig Dug is a very creative take on the maze game craze of the time. As I mentioned earlier, there was homage paid to the godfather of maze games with the whole veggie thing. It may not look as good as the arcade version, but it plays a lot like it, and because of that, it's aged really well. This isn't one of those 2600 games that only has a 5-minute sitting shelf life. It's quite addicting. I dig this version quite a bit. Q-Bert was released in the arcades in 1982 and ported to the Atari 2600 2 years later. You'll play as this wacky creature, Q-Bert, whose hobby consists of hopping along pyramids and changing their colors. I'm not even kidding, that's what it says in the manual. When you land on a cube, it'll change color, and your objective is to get every cube in the pyramid to the destination color. However, there are a few obstacles in your path. There's the purple ball that rolls down the pyramid, and once it gets to the bottom, it turns into a snake called Coily, who chases you around the pyramid. Either of these hazards kill you upon impact, and when they do, Q-Bert gets so pissed that he throws out some curse words. This may be the first time that a video game character swears, but I'm not so sure. You gotta love the sound effects they use to represent Q-Bert's profanity. It reminds me of the nonsensical gibberish that Ralphie's father blurted out in the Christmas Story to achieve the same effect. So aside from the enemies that kill you flat out, there's also Sam, this green bastard in sunglasses that can't hurt you. But he changes the color of the cubes back to the original, so you have to capture him to get him out of the way. You can jump onto these flashy dashes that are supposed to be flying discs. It'll send you back up to the top, and if Coily is anywhere near you, he'll be lured off the edge of the pyramid. So use these as an escape option if you're ever in trouble. Aside from all the hazards, there's also a green ball. If you grab it, it'll freeze everything on the screen except for you, and buy you some time to get away from trouble or knock off some extra cubes, not to mention bonus points. So how it works is there are 5 different game levels with 4 rounds each pyramid consisting of a round. So basically after every 4 pyramids there'll be some changes. In the first level you'll jump on a cube, it'll change to the destination color, and that's pretty much it. In the second level, the first time you jump on a cube it'll change to the intermediate color, and you'll have to jump on it again to change it to the destination color. So you basically have to jump on every cube twice. In the third level, you'll jump on a cube, it'll go straight to the destination color again, but if you jump back on it again, it'll go back to the original color. So this is when the strategy really starts to come in. You don't want to paint yourself into a corner and hop on some of the ones you already changed, because you'll need to change them again. In the fourth level, you'll jump on a cube, it'll change to the intermediate color, then the destination color when you jump on it again. But when you jump on it a third time, it'll go back to the intermediate color, and you'll have to jump back on it again to change it to the destination color. And in the fifth level, you'll jump on a cube, it'll change to the intermediate color, then the destination color, but if you jump on it a third time, it'll go back to the original color. It gets pretty freaking challenging because it's not like you can just hop through a specific sequence of blocks. You have to avoid all this other shit too, so your path could be thwarted. All these elements basically makes this a puzzle platformer. An interesting fusion of genres for 1982. You get 4 lives and get an extra life after the first 5 rounds, and then you get one after every 4 rounds thereafter. You can change the difficulty adjustments, but there are no game variations, which isn't a big deal, as this is one of those games that has a lot of substance even in its simplicity. Although it would have been nice to have the option to start out on one of the more difficult levels for shits and giggles. I do have 2 complaints, although they're both minor. The first is the control scheme. Moving the joystick up will move you up and right, down moves you down and left, right moves you down and right, and left moves you up and left. It's weird, but it's not hard to get used to, and an even better idea is to turn the joystick at an angle so you'll be directed appropriately. So although it's a little funky, it's a very minor issue. The other flaw is the lack of animation with the objects aside from Q-Bert. They just magically appear on the next block, which makes it harder to react if they're nearby. So I say just try to keep as far away from them as possible. Other than that, this port is well done and highly recommended. Have you ever wanted to play a fighting game starring Chuck Norris where you go around beating the shit out of a plethora of bad guys? Well, in 1983, Zonix released that game for the Atari 2600, Chuck Norris Superkicks. Your mission is to rescue an unnamed famous leader who's being held captive in a monastery by a group of assassins who go by the name Ninja. There are 2 main screens, the map screen which you'll use to navigate Chuck to the monastery, and the fight scenes where you'll have to engage in battle with one of the ninja's minions when you get ambushed. You'll start out as a white belt and you'll rank your way up to black belt as you defeat more enemies. After white belt there's orange, green, purple, brown, and black, but you also have to battle the time limit. I guess the ninja clan will kill this leader guy if their demands aren't met in a certain amount of time or whatever, so you can't be lollygagging around. And if you walk off the path into the grass, the time limit will accelerate tremendously, so don't do any of that shit. Be careful where you walk. You don't have any lives to lose. If you get beat in a fight, you'll get backed up, so the time limit is really your life meter. Each time you move up a rank, you'll get some time added as well, so not all hope is lost if you're running low. The controls on the map screen are a bit clumsy because you walk much faster horizontally than you do vertically, and the hit detection with the grass could have been better. Sometimes you hit a fork in the road, so you'll choose one of the paths and fight some schmuck, but some of these paths lead to a barrier that you can't cross. So you've wasted time and have to go back and take another path. Worse yet, you'll get ambushed again, wasting more of your time. So part of beating this game isn't just mastering the moves, it's also a trial and error process of figuring out which paths to take. And the correct path is totally fucking random, so you're just taking wild guesses every time you play. The enemies have different techniques, so you'll want to follow a specific strategy when fighting them. I mean, it's not the deepest strategy in the world, after all it's Atari, but there are strategic elements. For example, the Yakuza warriors at the beginning will throw ninja stars at you and protect their upper body, so you'll want to attack low and put your forearm up to protect yourself from the stars. Each set of enemies brings something slightly different to the table, so you'll have to learn their techniques and develop a strategy to counter it. Or you can just look in the fucking manual as it describes each enemy's tendencies. But it turns out the manual isn't a cheat sheet, it's almost a necessity. It's not exactly obvious that these arm thrusts your enemies are pulling here are in fact their blocking motion. So reading the instructions to know that's what you're looking for is pretty important before playing, otherwise you're just going to flail away and look like a jackass. Then there's the control situation. To punch, push the joystick up and press the fire button. To thrust kick, push the joystick down and press the fire button. To forearm block, push the joystick left or right and press the fire button. And to somersault kick, push the joystick left or right and press the fire button. Now, didn't the somersault kick's control sound a lot like the forearm block's controls? Yeah, that's because you push the same button combination to do both moves. Now, how the hell do you do that? Well, when you're a white belt at the beginning of the game, you don't know shit about fighting. Even Chuck Norris has to learn and practice his moves before becoming an expert, although for some reason he learns all of his techniques on the fly within a day on a mission to rescue a famous leader. Why the hell do they send in a white belt to save this guy? Oh well, the point is you don't know how to do the somersault kick right away. But the problem is, once you get to the screen where you learn the somersault kick, you forget how to do the forearm block. Now obviously this is to compensate for the limitations of the controls. You can only do so much with a joystick and one button. But at this point you're used to avoiding the ninja stars with the forearm block. Now you have to adjust yourself to attacking with this button combination instead of defending. And you have to resort to dodging the stars instead of blocking them. This can be a pain in the ass, especially since the ninja stars are what you want to avoid more than anything else. Getting punched or kicked just knocks you on your ass, but getting hit with a star will send you back to the map screen and you have to take the path to where you get ambushed again. So yeah, you'll pretty much need to follow the manual to keep up with the changing of the controls too. The combat is pretty mediocre, but for the 2600 they did a decent job with it, especially when you compare it to that abortion karate. However, there are still gameplay issues, like the fact that you have to stand still to punch or kick because thrusting up or down on the joystick to get the attack off will stop you in your tracks. This makes it a bit awkward to position yourself in the right spot to land a hit, and the somersault kick will become your natural primary attack once you learn it. The others will seem very weak in comparison. The difficulty is pretty sound once you get the hang of the controls, but once you get to the final boss, it's a goddamn nightmare. You'll have to take out a shitload of ninjas, battling 3 of them at a time, and after taking out several of them, they'll utilize their true ninja skills and go stealth on you, disappearing and reappearing. And the more of them you take out, the longer they'll stay hidden away, to the point where monitoring them is completely impossible, and sheer luck is the only possible method of winning. Eventually, the license to use Chuck Norris's name had expired, and the game was resold as Kung Fu Superkicks, similar to the Mike Tyson's Punch-Out situation. Chuck Norris Superkicks, Kung Fu Superkicks, whatever you want to call it. It's a relatively playable game, but there are too many issues that keep this game from being anything more than mediocre at best. By the way, I intentionally avoided using any Chuck Norris fact jokes in this review. That shit's old. The 1984 sci-fi comedy Ghostbusters was not just a surprise hit. It was a fucking phenomenon. So much so that Activision was approached by Columbia Pictures to develop a game for it. And since the movie was already out, they had to hurry the fuck up, specifically a month and a half. Less than half the time normally spent to develop a game from scratch. Due to the early deadline, Activision had to get off to a head start, so they took a game that was already in development, that was tentatively titled Car Wars, and built a Ghostbusters game around the concept. And it ended up becoming the driving shooter game that was released on various consoles, the main focal point being the Commodore 64 version. I've gone over the infamous NES version, but I'm going to talk about the Atari 2600 port today, which was the first version I personally played. You start out buying items in the shop. You get $5,000 to spend and 4 different items to buy. The image intensifier that lets you see Slimers easier in the ghost busting screen, the bait which lets you fend off the Marshmallow Man, the vacuum which lets you suck up the ghosts in the driving screen, and traps which you need to trap the Slimers in the ghost busting screen. You start off on the map screen, where you'll navigate the Ecto-1, represented by the Ghostbusters logo, around the city to specific flashing buildings where there's a spiritual disturbance. All the while, these other ghosts, called roamers, will slowly ascend to the top of the screen to the Zool building, which you don't want them to reach, so you can freeze all the roamers on the screen by running over one of them. If they do reach Zool, the Marshmallow Man is summoned and smashes a building, which costs you $4,000.
unless you can dick around with the right difficulty switch in time, and it activates the bait, which sends him away. The roamers will increase speed over the course of the game, but early on they're slow as shit, and they're only worth bothering to stop if they're along your way. The reason why time is important is because the PK meter is constantly increasing, and when it reaches 10,000, or really 9,999, the game ends. And if you don't have $10,000, the game is over. The way you earn money is to capture ghosts. So when you access one of the flashing houses, you'll enter the driving screen, where you just drive around sucking up ghosts with the vacuum cleaner. You won't get any money for them, but each one that slips past you adds another 100 points to the PK meter, so it's more of a preventative measure than anything. You'll get to the house and have to capture the Slimer. You drop the trap, set up your first Ghostbuster, then press the button to summon the other, position him, and then press the button again to activate their streams. And you use the joystick to maneuver each one closer, although you can't back either of them up. Pressing the button again activates the trap, and hopefully he's aligned with the trap and you'll catch him and earn some cash. The faster you catch him, the more money you get. If you miss, you'll be slimed. You also don't want to cross the streams. As Egon said, crossing the streams is bad. Anytime you cross the streams, run out of traps, or get slimed twice, then you have to go to the Ghostbuster headquarters. This will be the yellow flashing building, where you'll either stock up on traps or reacquire your lost Ghostbusters. Interestingly enough, the traps don't cost you any money, so it's pretty much a no-brainer to just buy everything. You have enough money for all 3 regular items plus 5 traps. You max out at 9. Now if you do have $10,000 when the PK meter reaches 10,000, then you get a final matchup with the Marshmallow Man where you have to slip 2 out of 3 Ghostbusters past him. If you succeed, you'll see the Ghostbusters crossing the streams, which, although crossing the streams is bad, it was a last resort in the final showdown with the Marshmallow Man in the film. So yeah, this was the one time it was okay to do this. You'll get a $2,000 bonus and advance to the next quote-unquote round, where you basically start the game all over again, but you maintain all your cash. And since you've gotten a $2,000 bonus, you only need to earn another $8,000 to face the Marshmallow Man again. If you fail, then you'll still be able to advance to the next round, but you don't get that bonus. So really the Marshmallow Man is a bonus round, and your goal is to beat the game as many times as you can and beef up your cash as high as you possibly can until you fail. But the way I kind of look at this game is that this Marshmallow Man is the final boss, and you don't really win unless you beat him. You can play the game however you want, but that's how I look at it. So it's quite robust of content for an Atari 2600 game. There are various screens with different playing styles, the graphics are well defined, and the Ghostbusters theme is very well done for a 2600 game, although the fact that it's on a constant loop throughout the whole game will grow tiring. There are things about it that I do like even more so than the other versions of the game, particularly the driving screen. There may not be a lot to it, you're just sucking up ghosts and steering to get yourself in position to do so, but unlike the other versions, it doesn't drag on for too long, you don't have all these bullshit obstacles getting in your way, and you don't have to worry about filling up your fuel tank, which was extremely tedious. The Ghostbusting screen does take a little time to get used to controlling, with the whole toggling between the two and using only one direction each once you fire your gun, but it makes the most of the controller's limitations without being too complicated. And since you can only fire the gun at one particular angle, it's simplified in a way. Although the Slimer can be a pesky dickhead sometimes. He'll be out of range and you really can't do anything besides sit and wait for him to get back in, if he even does at all, which unfairly cuts down on your payday. I think this version of Ghostbusters does the best job at balancing the gameplay amongst all the screens, and they thankfully replaced the stairwell screen with the extremely basic, but far less painful jumping Marshmallow Man screen. It's not a great game, there are flaws, but it's far more playable than other versions of this game, particularly the NES port.
E.T. was an enormously successful science fiction film about a young boy that develops a close friendship with a marooned alien. The same year as the release of the movie, 1982 to be exact, Atari released a video game based off of it for the 2600. It's widely regarded as one of the worst games of all time, has a tag for being a major contributor to the video game crash of '83, even to the point where its sales fell under expectations so much that urban legend states that thousands of copies were buried in a landfill in New Mexico. But is it really that bad? Let's see, but first let's look at the objective. You'll control E.T. right after his spaceship lands and accidentally abandons him, with the goal of exploring various screens to find 3 pieces of a phone to contact his alien buddies and go back to his home planet. The number at the bottom of the screen is your score and also acts as your life meter. It'll drain when you walk, teleport, and when you fall down one of these godforsaken pits, as well as float back up to the surface. Once you run out, you'll lose a life, and Elliot has to come to revive you. After you lose 3 lives, it's game over. Adding to your struggles is an FBI agent and a scientist who appears throughout the game and tries to get after you. If the scientist gets to you, he'll drag you to his lab, which really does nothing more than interrupt your progress. The agent is a lot more annoying. He'll take away a piece of the phone if you found any, and if you don't have any, he'll take away your Reese's Pieces. The Reese's Pieces are scattered throughout various screens. Once you get 9, you can call Elliot and he'll hand you a piece of the phone, but you can only call him when the game tells you can. At the top of the screen, an icon will be displayed, and pressing the fire button will extend E.T.'s head and activate that icon's function. If it's one of these arrows, it will teleport you to the screen that the arrow is pointing. The question mark will show you if any pit on the screen has a phone piece by flashing for a second. This circle with the dot in the middle will allow you to replenish some health by eating a Reese's Piece. This logo in the shape of the scientist's lab will send an enemy off the screen. This one of a person talking will allow you to call Elliot, like I mentioned earlier, and the phone will let you call out to E.T.'s spaceship. And once it does, you have a limited amount of time to find the launching pad on the forest screen where you originally landed, and the ship will come and pick you up, ending the game, providing, of course, that you don't get picked off by one of these assholes in the process. If these guys get overly irritating, you can play one of the other variations. Game 1 has both of them, Game 2 has only the FBI agent, and Game 3 has neither of them. So what's all the fuss about? It seems like a decent game on paper, so where does it fail? Well, first off, the game is fucking impossible to follow without the manual. Without knowing what the icons at the top of the screen represent, you'll just wander around picking up phone pieces and Reese's Pieces and not knowing what the hell to do with them. Meanwhile, you're getting chased by these pricks and falling down a freaking army of these pits. The pits are all over the place. You fall into them really easily thanks to the questionable hit detection, and a lot of times you'll cross screens and fall into one because a pit is connected to the border of the screen. What the hell? The pits are single-handedly the biggest problem with the game. There are far too many, they're too big in size a lot of the time, and they're so boring and monotonous you'll fall in, land, and then slowly float your way back up. And oh yeah, you'll fall right back into the same pit if you don't adjust yourself on the way out. Seems like E.T.'s feet trigger the fall down the pit more than anything else, because if you continue to move the joystick up, you'll fall back in. If you move down after surfacing, you'll end up back on land. Another annoyance is falling down the pit via teleportation. I guess they expect you to memorize the map and know whether or not the spot you're on will lead you to a fall. The high number of these pits make avoiding them all the more difficult when running away from these assholes, who just so happen to show up all the freaking time too. Not to mention that if you fall down a pit while trying to get away from them, you'll find them waiting for you as soon as you get out. Sometimes I just say fuck it and let them take my Reese's Pieces or drag my ass to the lab. I don't care, as long as I don't lose a piece of the phone. So yeah, the pits are true to their name. Along with some glitchy programming, they're easily the biggest problem with the game. That and the fact that there's really not a high fun factor level in walking around, falling down holes, trying to find pieces to a phone in some twisted scavenger hunt while constantly having to hit a roadblock by avoiding a pair of jackoffs that want to kidnap you or steal your candy. The real reason why so many people hate it at the level that they do is that they have no clue what to do. I did the same thing. When I was about 5, my cousin donated a shitload of Atari games to me when he had no more use for them. All the games were lone cartridges with no instructions, so I just did what everyone else did. I wandered around, fell down a bunch of pits, sometimes I'd get the phone on pure luck, but I didn't know how the hell to use it, and for years I wondered what the hell all those icons up top meant. The confusion mixed with the poor execution of the gameplay leads many to conclude that this game is an abomination. Combine that with the fact that the game was super hyped led it to be a huge letdown, causing it to be a contributor to the crash of '83, although it's not the lone reason, like many claim. Is it an awful game? Definitely. But is it the worst game of all time? Nah, there are definitely worse. Just play karate and tell me that it's better than E.T. The 1978 horror film Halloween was a pioneer, serving as the main influence for countless slasher flicks to follow. 5 years later, Wizard Video released a video game incarnation of the franchise for the Atari 2600. You play the role of the babysitter Laurie Strode in an attempt to save all the children you're babysitting from the psychotic murderer Michael Myers. To do so, you'll have to walk around a 2-story house with 8 rooms on each floor and a split screen. When you see a kid running around like a helpless schmuck, you gotta grab him by holding down the fire button and dragging him through each room to the room on the far end of either side of the house. The only rooms that Myers never goes in for some reason. But every other room, he can and will appear. He's very slow at first, but as you start racking up points for each kid you save, he'll eventually start getting faster progressively. Whenever he makes contact with you, he'll decapitate you and you'll run across the screen with blood pouring out of your stump. I don't know if this is supposed to be scary or downright fucking hilarious. Either way, it means you're dead. You get 3 lives, each of which is represented by a jack-o'-lantern at the top of the screen. Isn't that cute? If you have a kid in your possession, Myers will go after him instead, and if he kills them... Oh my god, that was fucking brutal, even for an Atari game. I mean, when you die, it's hysterical, but when the kid dies, I almost feel bad for his pixelated corpse. But the funny thing is, if Myers kills a kid, you don't lose a life, and it doesn't take away points. So really all it does is delay your progress and force you to go back and find another kid. Each time Michael Myers shows up, the Halloween theme plays, and it's a really good version considering it's Atari. But there's a problem. He appears way too much, like every friggin' room he'll pop up, which not only makes the song tiring, but it also kills the suspense. One thing they did to add suspense was make some of the room's lights flicker on and off. It definitely makes it more difficult to maneuver your way around Myers, especially when he starts getting faster. Another thing you can do is find a knife on the floor every once in a while to stab him, which causes him to run away. You can't kill him no matter how hard you try. You have to get the timing and placement down if you want this to work, because even after holding the button down, Laurie will pull the knife away after a very short time. The characters look good and the animation is done quite well. And like I said, the sound is great, although hearing the song start and stop continuously can get annoying. It's kind of fun for a little while, but its slow pace and repetition probably won't keep you up playing it all night. There were a good chunk of Sesame Street games on the Atari 2600, collectively known as the Children's Computer Workshop series. Some were finished, and some were unreleased or incomplete prototypes. I'm going to take a quick glance at each one. They all used the Kids controller, which is a 12-button keyboard that used overlays depending on which game you played. There were only 3 games aside from the Sesame Street series that used this controller, and they were all prototypes or unreleased. So only Sesame Street games actually had this thing. Big Bird's Egg Catch was released in 1983. You play as Big Bird, naturally, and the object is to catch eggs that drop from chutes as they're being laid from the hens above with the nest that rests upon Big Bird's head. The overlay simply gives you an option for left and right, as all you'll need to do is walk horizontally. In the easier modes, the chutes are a vertical straight shot down, and pressing left and right will move Big Bird directly to the other chute. But then the patterns start to get a little more complicated. They'll cross paths and even be invisible for a short time, and change patterns between each egg laid. After the tutorial variations, you'll have to manually center Big Bird under the chutes. The eggs will pick up speed, and in some cases will be invisible until it falls out of the chute. You'll have to watch for the hen's egg laying animation and follow the chute's pattern down. After each round, Big Bird heads out of the hen house to count the eggs, and then you move on to the next one. You'll start out with 5 lives, or 5 allowed misses, I guess you could say. You can add an extra life by catching the golden egg, which shows up in the later levels, once per stage, and is worth 5 points as opposed to just the 1 that regular eggs stand for. There's not much in terms of education. I mean, there is some counting going on, but once you get into the high numbers, your child probably isn't going to be able to keep up with it anyway, as the speed of the counting increases as the numbers ascend. But there is some early motor skill and hand-eye coordination practice going on. Plus, above all, it'll be fun for them, and they'll enjoy seeing a pretty good depiction of Big Bird for 2600 standards. Cookie Monster Munch, which also came out in 1983, is a scavenger hunt maze game. The overlay gives you up, down, left, and right movements, as well as an action button to pick up cookies. The object is to simply move Cookie Monster around a simple maze, or garden as the manual says, pick up the scattered cookies, and bring them back to the cookie jar. There's no time limit in the early stages, essentially making this a practice or tutorial for the middle levels that are timed. You can only carry 1 at a time, so you'll have to determine the quickest path to each cookie. Later on, the mazes are invisible, with the paths flickering momentarily each time you pick up a cookie to give you a hint as to what the maze looks like. There's also a 2-player alternating mode, as well as a Cookie Kid mode, where you pick up cookies with the kid, while Cookie Monster hops the fence from above whenever you have a cookie in possession and wanders around the maze. And if he stumbles upon a cookie, he'll eat it, taking a potential point off your score. Similar to Egg Catch, you'll get a count of the cookies you've collected as Cookie Monster eats them, increasing the speed as the count progresses, with his eyes rolling in pure ecstasy of a sugar high. Like in Egg Catch, the counting speeds up as the numbers increase, but it never gets to the insane levels of Big Bird's counting. The maze search is a good early problem-solving exercise for the little ones, and they should enjoy Cookie Monster's eating sequence. His sprite and animations are nicely done. Alpha Beam with Ernie, also released in '83, is a letter match game that takes place in outer space. The overlay gives you up, down, left, and right movements. You'll use a shuttle to grab fuel, which is represented by the letters that float around, and drop them into Ernie's ship, which is running out of gas. You have to drop the fuel into the correct bay based on the matching letter, and once you get all 4, Ernie's ship arrives home. He gets beamed down and waves at you. The early stages are basic tutorials, as the arrows will automatically center the shuttle under the fuel drums and bays with each press of the button, and all the letters are the same. Later on, you'll have to center the shuttle yourself, and they start mixing the letters up by order, as well as uppercase and lowercase letters. In the later levels, the letters on the rocket won't even be displayed, and it's up to you to place them in alphabetical order. There are 2-player cooperative modes where one player grabs the uppercase letters and the other grabs the lowercase letters. Then there's a time game and a variation where the letters in the sky don't all match the letters on the ship. You have to shuffle through the alphabet by grabbing one, which will replace it with the next letter in the alphabet sequence. There's also a custom option mode where you can spell your own 4-letter words for others to try. Just try not to teach your children some of the more colorful 4-letter words. So far, this game has more educational value than the previous 2, but the recognizable Sesame Street character doesn't show up during gameplay like the others do, only in the cutscene between levels, and even then Ernie's sprite is small. Oscar's Trash Race, released in 1984, is basically a number matching game. The overlay has up, down, left, and right movements, as well as a jump button, and 3 trash cans. Each race starts off with a dump truck that dumps out some trash on the ground. By pressing the appropriate trash can on the overlay, you pick the trash can with the corresponding number that's displayed that matches the number of pieces of trash on the ground. Then you move your grouch down, grab the trash, and bring it back to the starting line. After several rounds of this, depending on the level, the race is over, and you'll count the pieces of trash with Oscar in between, much like in Big Bird and Cookie Monster games. In the early practice tutorial, you don't even have to pick a number, as there's only one numbered can. The other variations allow a 2-player alternating mode, as well as an increased amount of trash, mud puddles that you'll have to jump over or you'll get stuck in them, increased speed, and time limit races to add challenge. There's also a rainy day mode where it will sporadically rain at some point during the race and the mud puddles turn blue and award you with additional points for jumping over them. It isn't quite as 3-dimensional as Alpha Beam, and you don't get to see any Sesame Street characters during gameplay outside of the legs of the non-Oscar monsters, but the depiction of Oscar during the cutscene is well done, and it's a generally fun game, for preschool standards of course. Grover's Music Maker was never completed, but a prototype does exist for download. You select a song by picking one of the letters of the alphabet, each of them representing a song, kind of like a jukebox. And from there, you can listen to the song as Grover dances, although I use that term loosely. Look at him. Pressing the button seems to trigger the notes, so I guess the idea behind this was to teach children rhythm and timing, as well as provide them with some music exposure. There's also a feature that lets you create your own music by pressing various buttons, but are you really expecting anyone at this game's age level to come up with the next Moonlight Sonata? This feature is really just an extra toy to play with, much like how preschoolers will usually push a bunch of random keys on a toy keyboard. The game was unfinished, so there may have been more to it planned out. There certainly were a few songs missing, as the alphabet maxes out once you get to T. Interestingly enough, Grover was actually going to be the lead part in the Egg Catch game. That's right, it was Grover's Egg Catch. Thankfully, someone pulled the plug on that one after realizing that Big Bird was a much better fit. You'd think they actually designed the whole egg catch concept around Big Bird, but I guess that wasn't the case. Finally, there was a planned game for the Count, called Count's Castle, but it was never finished, and no prototype has surfaced as of yet. I'm going to go out on a limb here and assume that it had something to do with counting, but I don't know, maybe I'm grasping at straws here. These games may not be incredibly educational, but no video game should be. If games are front-loaded with educational value and shortchanged with the entertainment value, then it's effectively no longer a game. Of course, these games aren't the most challenging in the world, but the target audience is preschoolers. I only played the Big Bird and Cookie Monster games when I was a kid, and even then I had already been playing enough games to where this was too easy for me. But there are at least a few degrees of difficulty for each game, so they're not just two-dimensional throwaways. If you want to introduce your preschoolers to video games, then these games are not bad options for them. Of course, at this point, there are a million games on consoles and tablets and computers for this target audience that are superior in every way. I mean, these games are not masterpieces by any stretch of the imagination, but kids should still be able to get some enjoyment out of these. Except Grover's Music Maker. Keep them away from that one for their sake and yours.
Pigs in Space was a recurring sketch that played on the popular Muppet Show, a parody of sci-fi shows like Star Trek and Lost in Space. In 1983, Atari released a game based off the sketches for the 2600. Pigs in Space is essentially 3 games in one. You select which one you want to play by picking one of the 3 pig heads on the title screen. The first one is a blatant Space Invaders ripoff called Chicken Invaders. You play as Captain Link Hogthrob, who is being bombarded by quote-unquote space chickens, who are dropping their devastating eggs, and you must thwart them off by chucking sausages at them. Shit, talking about this game is making me hungry. The big differences between this game and Space Invaders is that the enemies, or space chickens, don't pick up speed until you're down to the last one, and there are no bunkers in between you and the chickens, which opens up the space for you to attack, but also gives you nowhere to hide. It really does take away an element of the game. That being said, the controls are good, and the spinning gonzo head up top that represents the mystery ship looks great and is smoothly animated with its spinning motion. It doesn't measure up to the game that it's paying homage to. It's essentially a diet, caffeine-free Space Invaders that's the store brand, and it's not going to score any points for originality, but it's playable. The second game is also a carbon copy called Pastaroids, which isn't steroid-laced pasta. Nor is it a copy of Asteroids, as the title implies. It's actually copying Freeway, which in and of itself was already borrowing a lot from Frogger. You're Miss Piggy, first mate of the USS Swine-Trek, and you get caught up in a storm of spaghetti and meatballs. You have to get through the storm to board the Swine-Trek before it leaves port. Much like Freeway, you won't die or respawn at the bottom of the screen when hit. You just get bumped back a bit. And when you get to the other side, you have to actually make contact with the ship, so you could still run out of time even if you make it all the way across. One mechanic they did add to the mix is the ability to karate chop meatballs, which you have to execute when the meatball makes contact with you from the side. It doesn't take long for this to wear thin at all. Much like Chicken Invaders, the game's difficulty doesn't increase as you progress, so it gets pretty monotonous fairly quickly. The third and final game is Escape from Planet of the Gonzoids, which isn't a copy of any one particular game, but with so many other space shooters at the time, it might as well be. Playing as Captain Strangepork this time, you fly the Swine-Trek through what's described as a pizza mine. These little dipshits called Gonzoids that are perched over on the side and tossing pizzas at you. The opening between their attacks are short-lived, so it's always in your best interest to kill the Gonzoids that do get in your way. The aiming system, however, is a little weird. Your projectile does this awkward button hook pattern, so you have to line up just off-center from your target, but you also have to be sure you're firing in the right direction, which is all predicated on the last direction you moved the ship. So for example, if you last move toward the left, your bullet will curl left, and the same goes for the right. Now this boomerang trajectory is useful, but it's the only way to get a hit on any of these pricks, because guess what? They're all lined up behind walls you can't shoot through. On top of that, it's awkward to position yourself a lot of the time. Let's say you're shifting to the right and you want to hit this guy on your left. You're already coming from the left, so you have to overshoot to the right on purpose and then move left a bit to align yourself correctly. It feels so fucking unnatural. And on top of that, your own bullets can kill you on their way back. This makes the whole awkwardness of positioning yourself even more awkward. All of this combined make for a sloppy game, and it's by far the worst of the three. Aside from the lack of originality and the mediocre at best gameplay, another thing this game lacks is variety. Sure, there are 3 different games, but there are no variations with any of them. The difficulty never ramps up or changes, save for that one spot at the end of Chicken Invaders, and after you beat a stage, you're sent right back to the main menu, so there's really no advancement. Yeah, your point total is carried over, but other than that, what's the difference? I know that this was marketed toward younger kids, but really, your kid just might as well be playing Space Invaders, Freeway, or insert space shooter game title here.
Popeye was released by Nintendo in the arcade in 1983, and was ported to several consoles, including one of the launch titles for the Famicom, but the version I'll be talking about is the Atari 2600 entry. If you're aware of the cartoon the game is based on, it's not hard to imagine that you play as Popeye. The antagonist is Bluto, or Brutus as he was later called, and the damsel in distress is Olive Oyl. In fact, the original intention was to use these characters for the game that turned out to be Donkey Kong, but due to the inability to get everything licensed in time, Nintendo had to develop original characters, so Mario and Donkey Kong were born, and we all know how that went. Once Nintendo did get the licensing for the Popeye characters, they developed a different platformer to utilize them, although you do have to use the term platformer loosely since you can't jump. It's about as faithful as it possibly can be to the arcade game. All 3 of the stages are there, and the gameplay maintains most of the functions of the original. The goal is to collect the shit Olive Oyl tosses down, and you've got to collect them before they hit the bottom of the screen where they fall into the water and start drowning, I guess. After a short period of being in the drowning phase, the item will completely drown and you lose a life. So you gotta keep your eyes at all times on Bluto, the bottles that come at you, and for the bottom of the screen in particular for the shit that Olive Oyl tosses down. The shit that she tosses depends on the stage. It's hearts in the first stage, musical notes in the second, and in the third and final screen it's X's, which represent what the manual refers to as smooches. In the original game, you caught the 4 letters which spelled out help. I guess they felt like cutting corners by streamlining it down from 4 distinct sprites to 1. Other cut corners were the graphics, which is necessary in every arcade to Atari transfer, but at least you know what you're looking at. The characters are about as recognizable as they're going to get on the 2600. Bluto tosses beer bottles, or whatever his weapon of choice is, which you can thwart off by punching, and the otherwise invisible sea hag will also toss said beer bottles at you. The vultures from the pirate ship stage have been omitted from this port, but at least they kept the trampolines in stage 2. The big payoff, of course, is the spinach power-up, which you can only use once per stage. As you would expect, it basically awards you with invincibility, and you get free reign to batter Bluto into oblivion momentarily. Only downside to this is that Olive Oyl's items freeze in midair and float across the screen horizontally for some reason. But it's always a good idea to utilize the spinach in case you're trapped in front of Bluto, or you could actually use the item freezing functionality to your advantage, in case you have too many that are in danger of drowning, so it's not entirely a downside necessarily. Either way, you're going to want to use the spinach in every stage, if not for anything other than the satisfaction of smashing that dickhead across the screen, and to hear the pretty good version of the Popeye theme. All in all, this is a pretty damn good port of the classic arcade game.
The Smurfs were a widely popular Hanna-Barbera children's cartoon in the 80s. As a result, there would be quite a few video games based off the series throughout the years. The first one was released in 1982 for the Atari 2600 and ColecoVision. This video focuses on the Atari version. It's entitled Smurf, Rescue in Gargamel's Castle. You'll control a nameless Smurf who has to smurf through several screens, smurfing over various obstacles, and attempt to rescue the smurf-napped broad Smurfette. Aside from the obstacles, your other hazard is the timer, which is represented by an energy bar, so you can't be dilly-dallying around. Jumping is weird. You You move the joystick up once for a small jump, and then again immediately after to jump higher and forward to get over shit. Your first time through the cycle is ridiculously easy. Jump over a fence, then a river, then some steps, then a cave with a spider hanging off its web, then the river again, and then you simply hop a few platforms and bam, you've rescued Smurfette. But on the next go around, you get some enemies to deal with on each screen. A crow on the fence and staircase screens, a snake on the river screen, and a bat on the final screen. These enemies get faster each round to make it more challenging, and for some reason you have to repeat each screen one at a time, and then that increases exponentially each time. In other words, once you get past the fence and the crow, you have to face the fence and the crow for a second time in a row, and then the snake and the river twice, the stairs and the crow twice, etc. But then the next time around, you have to fucking face them 3 times, and then 4! It gets pretty annoying. Thank God it stops after 4. The graphics and animation are really good for Atari, and the background music, while repetitive, is also done well. And it also changes to a darker, more gritty version of the song when you enter the cave, staying in sync with the happy version when you enter and exit the screen. The fact that your only defense against enemies is to jump over them and run is a good anti-violence message to kids, but it also teaches your kid to be a pussy and not stand up for themselves when they're being attacked. Plus, some of the fun factor level is drained because of this. You should at least be able to jump onto them and kill them. Smurf may not be the fastest paced game in the world, and it's definitely not for everyone, but if you want to test your jump timing skills, then this is a good choice. Taz was released for the Atari 2600 in 1983. You play as the popular Tasmanian Devil from the Looney Tunes series, although you can really only tell it's him on the title screen, which is quite impressive actually. During the game, he's represented by a mini tornado, which is the form he takes in the cartoons a lot of the time. Your objective is to eat as much food as possible. You can move Taz freely around the screen to snatch up hamburgers, but you have to avoid the dynamite or you lose a life, and you start out with 3. Very simple concept. After eating a certain amount, the food variety will change and they'll each be worth more points. So you go from hamburgers to root beer to ice cream to popsicles. The only thing is, the speed doesn't seem to increase, and if it does, it's not noticeable at all. And it's pretty slow, so it's real easy to dodge the dynamite, especially since you're not running on a timer. So there's no rush to eat up as much as you can and slip into a stick of dynamite because of it. After the popsicles, you'll enter the crazed wave, and suddenly everything's moving at ludicrous speed. So you go from slow as molasses to fast as shit in the blink of an eye. Now, this is starting to become a challenge, but the only thing is, it's pretty fucking nauseating. Unless, of course, you stand in one spot and only move to dodge oncoming dynamite. Which turns out is a pretty slick strategy since there's no timer, but it's sure as hell a lot more boring. In this round, you'll be tackling apples, turnips, strawberries, and ice cream sundaes. Then it goes back around the loop to hamburgers again. There's a 2-player alternating mode, but no difficulty variations. So, all in all, it's a pretty one-dimensional game with a decent concept, but a few holes that needed to be filled. The Atari 2600 had some pretty bizarre concepts for games, like eat as much as you can until you puke, protect your teeth from cavities, fire a human being out of a cannon into a water tower, but this one right here has to be included in the top tier of the list. I Want My Mommy. The title alone pretty much screams what the fuck. Listen to this. You'll control Teddy, a little kid that has a nightmare and he only wants his mommy so he can feel better. So to reach mommy, you have to ascend these platforms that the manual describes as magical stardust ladders up a big mountain while avoiding dream demons that try to block your path. So it really seems like this kid is sleepwalking. Either that or someone spiked his Ritalin with a hallucinogen because he's seeing some weird shit. You start out with 4 lives. Making contact with any of these dream demons will send you into a swan dive off the beams, killing you. You can't jump, so the only line of defense is to run away. Or if you catch these floating blocks that are supposed to be your mommy's kisses, you'll become invincible. But it'll go away if you run out of time, or if you kill off a dream demon. Killing off a dream demon is actually quite effective, because they'll stay dead throughout the duration of the game. It's not like a Pac-Man ghost that makes a comeback. And since you could very well climb down the same platform, it's very helpful to not have another dream demon breathing down your neck. To ascend to the next platform, you have to set up ladders. These gray spots on the floor indicate where the ladders can go. Pressing the fire button sets the ladder up. But you can't just set up a ladder on each platform and go straight to the top. You have to put up a ladder in every possible spot. There are 2 ladders per platform, so you need to set up 10 ladders total. The only way to drop down to the platform below is to go down one of the ladders you set up already. So don't let a dream demon get between you and the ladder to get down unless you can set up a new one to go up. There are 2 screens. Neither of them are really any different from each other aside from the slight difference in platform length and the positioning of the ladder spots.
Also, on the first screen, the object at the top that you'll need to get to is a gigantic apple, and the second screen is the mommy. So what the apple is doing, I have no idea. If you die on the mommy screen, you'll be sent back to the apple screen, so you have to beat both of them consecutively, essentially making both screens one large stage. You really have to ascend 10 platforms and set up 20 ladders total. These dream demons are generally very predictable with their patterns. They'll just slowly wander from one side to the other, but they will change direction and head towards you when you're on their platform. So even though they're predictable, it's not exactly a cakewalk. Because you can't jump, you could easily find yourself fleeing from one demon and climbing up for higher ground only to find yourself getting stuck. There is a safe haven on the ladder if you get right within the grasp of the platform, but you have to be lined up in the perfect spot or you'll get killed. There's no point system, just a timer. But why does it count by tens, and why does it count so fast? Oh well. The graphics are nothing special. Teddy's animation is really weird, and I don't know why his feet are so goddamn big. And I don't know why the hell the dream demons look like ballerina dancers. This kid's got a really fucked up subconscious if he's dreaming this up. It feels a bit awkward at first to not be able to jump in a game that feels like it should be a platformer, but jumping would have probably made it a little too easy since the enemies are pretty one-dimensional. But then again, the whole game is pretty one-dimensional. It's just walk, climb, and avoid. I know simplicity can be a good thing, but I think they could have spiced things up a bit more. Put in an additional enemy, or add some difficulty settings maybe. But by the same token, this game was meant for kids, so I guess they didn't want to complicate things. The whole idea of getting a frightened child to his mommy for comfort is original if anything else. It's a pretty bland game, but it's still playable. And if you feel for Teddy, then you might actually get a little bit of satisfaction from winning and getting him to his mom. Video Olympics was one of the original 9 games that were released during Atari 2600's launch in 1977, and is one of several Atari games that are played with the paddle controllers. These controllers have a rotating wheel up top to control movement and the fire button to, well, fire. The second paddle controller is actually connected to the same port, so if you have 2 pairs, you can have up to 4 players if you've got a game that supports it. The cover of Video Olympics suggests that there are 50 games packed into the one cartridge. Technically this is true, but they're all roughly variations of the game Pong. Not to downplay the legacy of Pong or anything, it was the first video game to hit the mainstream and will forever be one of the most important games of all time. But can you really make 50 different versions of such a simple game? Well, there's really 7 distinct games, each with several variations, adding up to 50 altogether. The first one is a standard Pong game, and, well, it's Pong. Pressing down on the fire button will cause the ball to move faster, which is really the only way to get the computer to miss. Its paddle seems to have a magnet implanted in it that attracts the ball. One thing that's a bit strange is that you're on the right side while the computer is on the left. Usually by nature it's the opposite. Another weird thing is that Standard Pong is the only game in the entire cartridge that allows a one-player mode. All the rest must be multiplayer. It's bizarre, but I guess it's better than if it were the other way around. You can also play this game with 2 players, extra paddles, or 4 players for a doubles match. Next up is soccer, or foosball as it's called. Exact same game as earlier, except the goal has been shortened and you can use more paddles. Next up is hockey. Same as the soccer game with the shorter goal, except the net is away from the edge, allowing the ball to go behind it. And like the others, you can use multiple paddles in the other variations. Quadrupong is interesting, but the fun factor level isn't really there unless you have 4 players, each guarding one of the 4 sides. It would be pretty awesome if each player had a different score and it was every man for himself, but in both variations it's just a 2-on-2 tag team. The second variation lets you hold the ball for a brief period of time before releasing it. Then there's handball. Smack the ball to the other side and the opponent has to hit it on the rebound. Same rules as racquetball. You can have singles or doubles matches if you have 4 players. Volleyball tries to take Pong into a different direction by having the paddle scroll horizontally instead of vertically, and you have to hit the ball over the net in the center. There's an option to use the ability to switch the vertical position of your paddle, but it doesn't really help out the playability all that much. The problem is that the ball moves way too fucking fast, and it's hard to catch up to it. The beauty of standard Pong is that you can make the ball go faster gradually, making the volleys more intense, but this is just frustrating. I guess you can master it with a lot of practice, but really, do you want to? There's a 4-player doubles option here too, but whatever. The final game is also a disappointment, basketball. Like in volleyball, the ball is gravitated, but at least this time you can let it fall to the floor without losing points. The tough part of this game is scoring. You're only allowed to cover your half of the court, which diminishes the fun factor level of a one-on-one game, although your jurisdictions cross just a little bit, but not enough to make a difference. and you have to score in the opposite basket of the side you're on. Now that wouldn't be so bad if aiming wasn't so ridiculous. You really have just as much of a chance of sending the ball into your own basket, especially if you use the variation where the ball gets more bounce. Holy shit, does this game ever get insane. You know how sometimes if you run a lot more than your body's used to and you wake up the next morning and your legs are sore as hell? Well, that's the way your eyes will feel after playing this game for 10 minutes. You can use the options of changing the paddle's position, the amount of bounce the ball has, the ability to hold the ball, or the use of 4 players in a 2-on-2 game. So don't be fooled, this isn't really 50 games in one. It's 50 variations of 7 different Pong games. 2 of them are bad, and 5 of them are pretty average. But you have to remember also that this was 31 years ago, only 5 years after the original Pong was released. It was during the baby stages of the Atari 2600, and this so-called collection of 50 games are still a hell of a lot better than Action 52. One thing Atari will probably always have over every console ever made is the sheer number of wacky concepts for games. How about this one, for instance, fast food. The object is to eat as much cancerous food as possible until you upchug. You control a pair of obscene purple lips and a shitload of fast food will fly across the screen from left to right. There's burgers, fries, milkshakes, pizza, all kinds of shit. Catch as much of it as you can, and after a little while, the text, "You're getting fatter," will scroll up the screen. Each time it does this, the food gets faster. Fast food, how clever. But not all the food is good. Well, not that any of it is really good for you, but the rotting purple pickles will make you sick. If you eat 6 of these things, you'll burp all your food back up and the restaurant has to close because you turned it into a biohazard. The top portion of the screen will display purple pickles to indicate how many you've eaten. Every 500 points, or calories, 1 pickle will be wiped off your meter. I guess all that extra food helped to digest the poison. While the game holds your interest for a little while, its novelty doesn't take too long to wear off. By that time, the food is traveling so fucking fast it's nearly impossible to distinguish the fast food from the poisoned pickles, making the game pure luck at this point. Plus, the rapid rate of the flying food is real nauseating to look at if you have a weak stomach. You might not be able to sue the makers of fast food for making you fat, but you may have a case against them for causing sudden epileptic seizures. The controls are pretty good. It's real easy to move the lips freely around the screen, but it's weird because some of the shit's moving at different paces, so you have to constantly be adjusting. It's like dealing with your girlfriend while she's on the Plan B pill. The best strategy to use really is to line up against the back of the screen and resist the urge to scrounge up more food by leaning forward. You'll have more time to react this way, and you'll probably keep yourself alive longer. Fast food is a decent little time killer. Unfortunately, it'll get tiring faster than the food.
Atari 2600, called the Video Computer System at the time, was launched in 1977. Atari developed 9 games to be released as its launch titles along with the console, including Combat, which was bundled with the system upon purchase. So there were people in charge of making the decisions on what kind of games should be made available to really draw people in from the get-go. How about 2 tanks blowing each other up? Sounds like fun. Let's make that the game we bundle with the system. Oh, and how about a competition of who can blow up the most vehicles out of the sky and the sea? Sounds exciting. Check. What else? Oh, how about a game where you solve map equations? Yeah, people love basic math. Let's turn it into a game and call it Basic Math. Hence, one of the 9 games released at launch of the Atari Video Computer System, later known as the 2600, was Basic Math. It's math, and it's basic. So the game definitely lives up to its name. You solve addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division problems using the joystick to select each digit in your answer. You can toggle whether you want 1 or 2-digit problems, a 24-second time limit to answer, a 12-second time limit, or no time limit. You get 10 problems to solve, and your score of how many you answered correctly is displayed at the end. One thing you gotta know about double-digit answers is that you have to make sure you put the first digit in the right spot. If you start from here and work your way to the right, it's incorrect, even if it appears as the correct number. These judges are robots after all. Also, with division problems, you want to leave a space and enter the remainder on the right side. Other than that, what you see is exactly what you get. There's really not much to talk about. The colors at least change up, and it's easy to navigate through the numbers, which I know doesn't sound like it should be a problem, but that didn't stop the memory game concentration from having questionable navigation.
One positive I'll say, though, is that the addition of a time limit does give some tension to finishing your answer. But at the end of the day, this game is what it's supposed to be, I guess. But the question is, why the fuck does it exist? I know this was 1977 and the home video game market was in its infancy, so there was to be a lot of trial and error. Maybe the line of thinking was that having a homework-based game would lull parents into buying it for their kids. But aside from that, is there any other way this could have been presented as a good idea?
Most video games have titles, right? Well, here's one that doesn't. Not exactly, anyway. Name This Game, released by US Games in 1982. With a title like this, you'd figure the game is probably so bizarre in content that no title really fits, so they just said fuck it, name it yourself. But that's not really the case. You play as a scuba diver who just recovered buried treasure, but there's a shark that's pissed off about it for some reason. The manual actually says that the shark believes the treasure is his. So you have to keep the shark at bay, and at the same time fend off an octopus that's blocking your way back to the surface. They don't really explain what the octopus's beef is. The octopus's tentacles will extend toward the bottom. You have to shoot them down to keep them from touching the bottom of the screen. The tentacles are connected by blocky pixels that shift around. If you shoot the bottom block, the entire tentacle will retract and start its descent all over again. The shark moves across the screen and descends a level each time he gets completely to one side, and gets faster the closer he gets to you. You get more points for shooting him when he's closer to you, but of course then you run the risk of death, so be careful. You also have an oxygen level that will deplete over time. You can refill it whenever your friend up there on the boat drops you a line. Who looks like he's having the time of his life on the boat while his friend down below is fighting for his life against the world's largest octopus and an insane shark that's obsessed with material possessions. You have to get to the oxygen line quickly though, as it won't be available for very long. Holding the fire button down will keep you firing consistently, but the rapid rate isn't very good. Only one bullet will be on the screen at one time, and it doesn't travel very fast, so it's not exactly a fast-paced shooter. The controls are fine, but one complaint that I have is when you find yourself against the edge of the screen. It's a little tough to explain, so here it goes. Your diver will always hold the gun in front of him. When you turn, you'll be firing from the opposite side of his body. Now, if you end up on the edge of the screen and turn around slightly, you can't turn back around right away. You have to give yourself some room, so you find yourself shifting away from the edge and then moving back. It doesn't sound like it happens all the time, but you may find yourself in the situation more times than you expect. Other than that, this isn't a bad game. There's just a lack of variety. There's a 2-player alternating mode and 3 difficulty variations. But aside from the speed increasing as the game goes on, nothing really changes. This wouldn't be a huge issue though if the game were a bit more exciting. A few tweaks could have been made and this would be a pretty good shooter. But to its credit, it's fairly decent. The game really should have been given an actual name though. Treasure Diver or Octopus or something. But guess what? There is a legitimate reason for this. US Games offered a $10,000 prize for whoever they felt could come up with the most creative name for the game. But they went bankrupt before the prize was ever decided, and so the game continues to have no real name. Much like Sword Quest, another unfulfilled gaming prize from the early 80s. Such a shame. Video Pinball was released for the arcade in 1978, and ported that same year as a standalone console release, and finally followed by an Atari 2600 port in 1980. You get a very basic design for a pinball machine. There's a lot of open space, and it's hard to picture a pinball machine that's wider than it is long, but it does manage to hold a pinball feel, although I would have liked to see the ball travel faster than it usually does. You maneuver the flippers with the joystick. Left is left, right is right, and up operates them both at the same time. You can also nudge the machine by holding down the fire button and using the joystick to shift in the direction you want. But if you cause it to tilt, then you won't be able to acquire any more points or extra balls, and you start out with 3. You score points by hitting the bumpers, spinners, drop targets, and rollovers. The rollover with the Atari logo will give you an extra ball if you hit it 4 times. There are 2 difficulty settings, 2 game variations that allow or disallow the point value to be added to the bumpers cumulatively between games, and a 2-player alternating mode. The design may be bland, plus it's the only screen of the whole game, and it may not be the fastest paced game in the world, but pinball isn't that complicated to begin with, and it's usually pretty fun in nature, so to its credit, Video Pinball does maintain some of the addictive elements that make pinball what it is. If pinball isn't your thing, then don't bother with this. But if you enjoy bouncing the silver ball around every now and then this isn't a bad translation.
Tic-Tac-Toe is a simple little game that you play when you need to kill some time. 9 boxes, X's and O's, get 3 in a row, and that's it. Somewhere along the way, someone decided to expand upon it with a 3D variation, also known as cubic, using a 4x4 grid, and dropping 3 more boards underneath it to make it 4x4x4. This incarnation of the game would find its way onto the Atari 2600 in 1980. The game uses the same mechanics as traditional tic-tac-toe, only instead of completing a row of 3 blocks horizontally, vertically, or diagonally, you do the same with 4 blocks, and you can also connect 4 going straight down a column using all 4 boards, as well as marking off a horizontal, vertical, or diagonal row using all 4 boards. It's certainly an interesting take on the original classic, but does it translate well to the Atari 2600? Well, the boards are presented pretty well with the pseudo-isometric view. It's not ideal, but it's about as good of a 3D representation as you're going to be able to get on the 2600. It would be a lot tougher to follow if it were displayed like this. But there are a lot of things that are left to be desired, like how sluggish the controls are. I mean, it's not a game where you need to react quickly or anything like that, but it would have been nice to be able to move your cursor around the board a little faster. I also don't really like how the CPU's last move flickers. I know it's an indicator of what their last move was, in case the sudden awkward black screen transition between moves was too distracting to notice where they last played. But it is a little distracting. It's kind of an eyesore. Also, although the X and O graphics are distinct from each other, the visual of all these blocks played does get to be a bit of a tangled clusterfuck when you're looking at it from all these angles. I think it could have helped if they did some kind of color coding system, like maybe white for the default blank squares, red for the X's, and blue for the O's, some shit like that. It would have just made it a bit easier to follow, even if it ended up looking like a rainbow vomited all over the fucking thing. At the end of the day, though, the game generally plays how it's supposed to. It does get a bit disorienting, and the controls could have been more fluid, but if you do enjoy playing Cubic, you'll be able to get something out of this game. But I'd still suggest alternate methods instead. Like, I don't know, a piece of fucking paper and a pen. Any game that you can perfectly emulate with a pen and paper should not be packed into a cartridge and sold for $30. It's not like you want to play the box game in video game form. Board games in general are already borderline justifiable when it comes to video game incarnations. If there's nothing vastly different about the video game version, then all they are is a convenient way to not have to set up the pieces and put them away when you're done. But a game that's set up only includes drawing some boxes, that does not need a video game release. So, 3D Tic-Tac-Toe on the 2600 is what it is. It manages to play out a functional version of Cubic, but its existence is unnecessary.
Bobby's Going Home was released by Bit Corporation for the Atari 2600 in 1983. You play as Bobby, a kid who, you guessed it, is going home. But this trip home is a little unusual, as there are more deadly hazards than any walk home I've ever experienced. You've got deadly birds like hawks, ducks, and butterflies. What the fuck? How does a butterfly kill you? Some will fly overhead, and some waddle around on the ground. The biggest pain in the ass is how these overhead birds will fly low to the ground, and their patterns are sporadic. Are you sure these are hawks? They seem more like moths with these unpredictable flight patterns. On top of that, there's no way to attack them. Plus, you can't crouch, so the only thing you can do is retreat, which really sucks because you're slow as shit. You jump really slowly too, but thankfully you get some moonwalk level height from your jumps, and you can position yourself in midair. You're not stuck with a specific trajectory like you are in a lot of games with broken jumping controls. However, it's still far from perfect, mostly due to the slow speed. If you've got a bird flying and you're trying to land between it and one of the little bastards on the ground, you might have to do some finagling to position yourself accordingly. It feels very unnatural. Jumping over pits in general is fine, but there are some that open up and close. Doesn't this look familiar? Oh yeah, Pitfall. However, unlike that well-executed classic, this game's shape-shifting pits have a much thinner margin for error. The only way to get across is pretty much by walking across as it's opening, and then leaping at the seemingly last possible pixel just as it starts to close up to be able to land on the other side. There's also a timer that ticks down. As you cross over to the next screen, more time is added, so you're encouraged to finish as fast as possible, which is really conflicted with the fact that you have to be patient sometimes with these fucking birds and pull off these gymnastics while waiting for an opportunity to move ahead. I will say that the graphics are pretty good. There's plenty of color, the backgrounds are nice, and there's fine little additives like the planes and the sky. Although at first I thought it was an enemy that was gonna swoop down and attack me. The fact that background sprites being pretty uncommon in an Atari 2600 game really threw me for a loop. Also, the music deserves a nod for having a pretty well done tune that actually changes tempo from screen to screen, although I don't think it represents anything in particular. There's also a wide variety of screens. You've got 7 screens to track through before making it to your house, and that completes one level. And there are 32 levels altogether, totaling 224 screens. The game definitely tries to resemble Pitfall with the screen scrolling, pit jumping, and avoidance of enemies, but there needed to be more. I know there are a lot of levels, but they start to run together very quickly. And besides all the flaws I previously mentioned, there should have been more meat added to the actual gameplay, like maybe items to collect to rack up points, time, or extra lives, or more desirably, a gun of some kind to shoot down these damn birds. I know Pitfall didn't have any weapons, but it didn't need any. The exploration was plenty. You didn't find yourself in frustrating situations such as this trying to squeeze your way between this shit. Obviously, I had no expectation of this coming anywhere close to Pitfall, and I hate to make this sound like a comparison video, but I would hope that if you're gonna heavily borrow from a formula, that you'd borrow some of the qualities that made your source of inspiration work in the first place. Bobby is Going Home, of course, is no Pitfall. It's not even a second or third-rate Pitfall. It's more like a third-rate Smurf on Atari 2600, which had far less screens, but there was more variety to the screens in that game. But that's a good example right there in how quality is better than quantity. Bobby's Going Home is not an unplayable game. In fact, even with all of its flaws, it still does retain a little bit of an addictive quality. You want to go back and outperform yourself from the last go-around. But at the end of the day, you'll find yourself getting tired of it fairly quickly because of all its flaws, no matter how much you might want to advance further the next time around. Which is a shame because this game did have some potential.
California Games was released by Epix in 1987 for several consoles including the NES and Commodore 64. It was a huge success, but I'll be talking about the lesser-known Atari 2600 version. You play a series of 4 events: hacky sack, half-pipe, BMX, and surfing. Anywhere from 1 to 8 players can compete in all 4 events, each of which you'll win by racking up points for tricks or stunts, with an overall winner crowned at the end based on the rankings. You start out picking a list of sponsors and assigning one to each player. This is really nothing more than a means of identifying each player. I don't know if it would have taken up a lot of memory to install a name entry system, or if it was more trouble than it was worth to do so, but whatever, it's not a big deal. And if it is due to conserving memory, then it was a good move, because they did a damn good job of making the most of the 2600's limitations. The graphics and animation are both really impressive for the console. The sound is crystal clear, and there are a lot more tricks you can pull off than you would think with the basic joystick. The music in particular is well done too, although most of the time it's Louie Louie by the Kingsmen. It's a pretty good rendition. The song will play between each event and at the title screen, but you'll hear other tunes strewn about in there too, which probably puts this in the conversation for a most robust soundtrack on the Atari 2600. So the first event is Footbag, or Hacky Sack. You have 90 seconds to keep the ball in the air with your legs and feet for as long as you can, and you can also headbutt. You'll score points by stringing together as long of a run as possible before the ball hits the ground, and you'll rack up some extra points with stunts. You use the joystick to control ball movement. Positioning determines the type of kick, which makes it so that you're doing just enough to influence the type of kick without making it too complicated by giving you button combinations, for example, especially with the limited amount of options with the joystick. In the half pipe, you can perform up to 6 tricks with different combinations using the joystick and fire button. It's all about timing and knowing when to let go of the buttons. You'll fall if you hold them down for too long, but you'll score more points for a longer held stunt. So it's high risk, high reward. Like I said, it's all about rhythm. It plays similar to the half pipe option in Skate or Die, which interestingly enough came out the same year. The BMX event is a side-scroller race, similar to Excitebike, only it's not really side-scrolling as much as it is screen-scrolling, like Pitfall, for example. The fire button jumps, the joystick accelerates and decelerates, and performs stunts while in midair for additional pointage. You also score points for hitting checkpoints and finishing the race before the time runs out. The more time you have left on the clock, the more points you earn. So you have to strategize whether or not to go big for points with stunts and risk wiping out and costing you points, or keep focused on time and finishing the course. You also have to consider your speed. You can fly like a bat out of Hades, but in all likelihood, you're getting wiped out as a result of it. Obstacles like rocks, stumps, and cow skulls can knock you on your ass, and bumps, mud, and cacti can cause you to lose control. This is definitely the most fun of the 4 events. The final one is surfing. Use the joystick to balance yourself on the board and perform tricks, while the fire button cuts your turn chopper. You have 90 seconds to score as many points as you can from performing tricks. One thing to keep in mind is that you can't rack up points for spamming one particular move. After 10 reps of one trick, you won't be able to score any points off it. And you'll know when you've maxed out because the sound cue that plays when you do score points won't be heard anymore. So in short, variety is the key to maximizing points, as it should be. If you want to play a particular event without all the hullabaloo of going through the gauntlet, there's also a practice mode. California Games gets lost in the shuffle because it was released late in the console's lifespan, and there are superior ports of it on stronger consoles, but this is more than a worthy game to add to your collection, and can be a lot of fun in a multiplayer competition, even if you're just alternating. I recommend it.
Bowling is not the best spectator sport in the world. It's one-dimensional, and the shoes are hideous as fuck. But that doesn't stop it from being a fun game, particularly with friends. And despite the aforementioned one-dimensional characteristic, it still has appeal in a video game outlet. After all, it's one of the staples of the Blockbuster Wii Sports package. But how did the sport fare for the Atari 2600, especially in 1979, the early era of the console? Well, visually, it's very rudimentary. The bowler, bowling ball, and pins are quite blocky, particularly the pins. They're literally blocks. And there's not much to speak of for animation. There's just a 3-frame approach sequence for the bowler, the pins quickly knock away, and the ball itself never even has a roll motion. The horizontal lane is a departure from what would become the norm of the first-person view in later bowling games, but it would have probably been difficult to display the pins clearly on the 2600 in that format. The order of operations hasn't changed much over the years. You line the bowler up and let her rip. There's no power or accuracy meter here, though. Instead, it's all about where you line up and how much spin you put on the ball afterward, providing you have that option on. There are 3 variations for this. Either A, your post-roll spin is turned off completely and you're simply lining your player up and bowling in a straight line. B, you can add spin to the ball and let it travel in a particular direction at your command after you roll. Or C, you can manipulate the direction of the ball after you roll and even steer it from side to side. There's a bit of a delay in the controls of this ball spin, but that's done intentionally, so you don't just free will the ball directly into the center for an easy perfect 300 every game. There's a semblance of timing here.
And although it may look sluggish and flat, the physics are actually pretty solid, and pins can knock each other down, so you won't get the same results of which pins are left standing every time, especially if you set it on the harder difficulty, which randomly makes it more difficult to knock down strikes. There aren't a ton of options, and you can't play with more than 2 players, but if you have a group of people, just hold a tournament or divvy everyone up into 2 teams, use your imagination. At least the game keeps score for you. Overall, the game's not going to bowl you over with its addictive gameplay or anything like that, and it hasn't aged terribly well, but it's still pretty playable. Basketball was released in 1978 for the Atari 2600. Everything is about as simple as it gets. It's a one-on-one matchup. Each basket is worth 2 points no matter where on the court you are, and the only variation option involves changing the speed of the players. The game is about as old as it looks. The background is plain, the nets are blocky, and the players are stick figures with limited animation, almost like the fighters in Karate, arguably the worst Atari 2600 game of all time. But thankfully, that's where the similarities begin and end between those 2 games. Even on the slower setting, the players will move like Usain Bolt in comparison to the quicksand you feel like you're walking in on Karate. There aren't any special moves, no jukes or spin moves or anything like that, but the fluid control allows for some creativity when trying to get by the defender. Since it's one-on-one, there's no passing, which is good since the controller only has 1 button. That would have made things convoluted. To shoot, hold the button down and the ball will move vertically in front of him. The higher the ball is when the shot is taken, the higher the arc on your shot, which is a crucial element to the game. Without it, the conversion rate of your shots would be completely random. Instead, the objective is to get the ball as close to the basket as possible before taking your shot, which was realistic to the game of basketball at the time, until they brought the 3-point line into the mix. The computer opponent gives you a competitive game, although sometimes he runs around aimlessly like a jackass when on defense. When defending, you can steal the ball if you line up directly with your opponent during their dribble. It also helps that you're always facing the ball, preventing the needless task of having to turn yourself around. Aside from the archaic graphics, my only other gripes would be the fact that you can't control yourself in midair during your jumps, limiting your shot blocking, and the audio is made up of mostly fart noises, which at least sounds better than the annoying-ass constant squeaking of the real game. It's like rusty nails to a goddamn chalkboard. But this game excels expectations. There's no reason why a 39-year-old basketball game should hold up as well as this.